Chapter 1. New York State, February, 1924. Alison plopped down on her bed, excitedly watching her best friend, Ruth. "Well? What do you have to tell me?" She'd seen Ruth talking to Walter after church that morning, so she had a pretty good idea what she wanted to tell her. Alison had been in love with Walter for over 4 weeks now, and she could see by the look in his eyes that he loved her as well. Ruth looked down at her hands and blushed. "Well, it's about Walter." Alison nodded anxiously, waiting for Ruth to tell her that Walter was in love with her. And? Why is she prolonging the agony? She needs to just say it. "He's asked my pa if he can court me." Ruth's eyes finally met Alison's, the excitement on her face palpable. Alison drew her brows together in confusion. "You mean he's going to ask my father if he can court me, right?" Ruth shook her head. "I'm sorry, Alison. I know you've had a crush on Walter, but he asked my pa if he could court me, and my pa said yes. He's coming over for dinner with my family this evening." "You're going to tell your pa that you don't want him to court you, though, right? Because you know I love him and you'd never betray me that way." Alison's words were firm, not questioning. She was issuing an order, and Ruth had been friends with her long enough to know it. Ruth blinked a few times. "Betray you? What do you mean?" "Of course, I wouldn't betray you, but you know I've had feelings for Walter for over a year now. Aren't you happy for me?" Alison turned away, furious that her friend was acting that way. Ruth was Alison's only friend, because Ruth always did what she was told. If Ruth had a hair bow Alison liked, Ruth would remove it and give it to her. If she had a sandwich Alison wanted in her lunch pail, she would always give it to Alison. Why wasn't she doing what she was supposed to do and telling Alison she'd give up on Walter? What was her problem? Alison carefully calmed herself before turning back around to face Ruth. Of course, she couldn't let Ruth marry Walter, but she needed to play along for a little while until she came up with a good plan to get them apart. "Of course, I'm happy for you, Ruth." She hugged her friend. "I couldn't be anything else. You know I love you like a sister." Inside, she was seething, but she'd wait until Ruth was gone before she had her tantrum. Ruth had brown hair and brown eyes. There is nothing remarkable about the girl, Alison thought snidely. There is no way Walter will choose her over me when he realizes I'm interested in him. He probably just thinks I'm too pretty for him. Alison pushed her long red hair away from her face, seething inwardly. "Just remember, I get to be maid of honor." Ruth smiled. "I wouldn't choose anyone else." Minnesota, April 1924. Maggie hugged her mother-in-law tightly. "Thank you for coming over to watch the children today. Why on God's green earth would you thank me for watching my beautiful grandbabies?" Millie held year-old Helen on her hip while 3-year-old Kenneth sat at the table, finishing his breakfast. "I'm glad you were able to do it on such short notice." Maggie sighed. "I'm not looking forward to the drive to St. Paul to pick up my sister." She wondered if she should warn Millie about her sister, but she knew the whole family would understand soon enough. "How long is she going to stay?" Millie turned her head and nodded at her son, Daniel, as he walked in the door from milking. Maggie shrugged. "I'm not sure. For a while I'm sure. Mama just said she needed some time away from New York while Papa recovers from his heart attack." She didn't mention the trouble her sister had gotten into back home. She didn't want to gossip about her only sister, or give Millie a reason to dislike her on sight. Daniel listened silently. He'd read the letter from Maggie's mother, and knew the truth, but he agreed with Maggie. People needed to make their own decisions about the girl after she arrived. "We're going to be gone all day. Are you sure you don't mind, Mama? We can take them with us if we need to." Millie shook her head adamantly. "You cannot take these babies on that long drive. They'd be fussy and worn out by the end of it, and I'd be worried sick. I'm going to have a good time with my grandbabies. You two enjoy the drive alone for a change." Daniel put his arm around Maggie's shoulders. "Sounds good. You know where everything is. We'll be back as soon as we can." Daniel led Maggie out to the wagon. He helped her to the seat and climbed in beside her. I don't like you making this long drive in your condition, he told her for the 15th time since they'd received the letter 4 days ago. I know. I'll be okay, though. I'm only 3 months along. He nodded, knowing he wouldn't sway her. They'd been married for 4.5 years, and he hadn't yet met any of his in-laws. From the stories she told him about Alison, he was pleased about that fact. Are we still going to tell the family after church on Sunday? He asked. I think we should. Alison will get to be part of it then, he sighed. I know she's your sister, but I'm really not looking forward to her coming to live with us. What if she causes the kind of problems she caused in New York? Maggie closed her eyes in defeat. I don't know. I know Mama and Papa were always too lenient with her. We have to let her, now we expect better behavior from her. I'm not sure what else we can do. I guess we really don't have a choice. Alison stood at the train station, scanning the crowd. Where's Maggie? I know Mama sent her a letter that I was coming today. Maybe she didn't get it in time. What will I do if she doesn't come? Alison could feel the panic rising. Her train had pulled into the station 15 minutes early, but Maggie should have been there waiting for her. Maggie knew how much she hated to wait. Finally she saw her sister weaving her way through the crowd. She glared at her. I thought you'd never get here. Maggie smiled. I'm 5 minutes early. She reached out and hugged her younger sister. It's good to see you. Alison pulled away and made a face. If you'd wanted to see me, you could have made the train trip home. It's ridiculous that I had to travel to the middle of nowhere to see you when you could have just as easily come back to civilization. Maggie reached behind her and pulled Daniel forward. Ally, this is my husband, Daniel. Daniel, my baby sister, Alison. Daniel nodded, looking at the girl. She was dressed modestly and her long red hair was up in a bun on top of her head. She didn't look like the hellion Maggie had described, but the few words he'd heard from her mouth had been true to his wife's description of her. It's nice to meet you. Alison nodded and pointed to her bags. She slipped her arm through Maggie's and headed in the direction she'd seen the couple come from, simply assuming Daniel would get her things for her. The train ride out here was awful. It took forever and the people were dirty. I don't ever want to have to ride in a train again. She took a quick breath and continued. When I go home, I want to go in a motor car. One of the young men at our church in Kippa owns one and it's so much fun to ride in. She didn't add that she'd been told it was fun. No one invited her to do anything except Ruth, and she'd ruined that forever. Ruth was getting married in 2 days, and nothing Alison had tried was able to put a stop to that. I'm sorry the train ride was so terrible. Maggie glanced over her shoulder and saw Daniel was keeping pace with them, carrying Alison's 4 bags. How she had enough clothes to fill 4 bags, Maggie would never know. Her parents didn't make enough money to lavish their younger daughter with clothes. The food on the train was abysmal, so I hope you expect to take me to a restaurant before we make the long trip to the middle of nowhere. Alison crossed her arms over her chest as she issued what was basically an order. Maggie sighed. I made some sandwiches and potato salad. We're planning on stopping for a picnic on the way home. When she saw her sister's disgusted look, she added, if you don't smile about it, you won't get any of the cookies I made for dessert. Alison groaned. I'm 18 now, Maggie. You can't coax me to smile with sweets or withhold them if I don't. She couldn't help but punctuate her words by stomping one of her feet. Alison wanted to scream. It was bad enough her parents had sent her off to the middle of nowhere to punish her, but now her sister thought she was going to control her? Maggie had always been jealous of her because she was the one Mama and Papa loved best. They reached the wagon, and Daniel stowed the 4 bags in the back. He offered Maggie his hand to help her onto the wagon and then turned to hold his hand out for Alison. An old farm wagon, she groaned. Are you telling me I didn't even merit a carriage? She stared in shock as Daniel dropped his hand and walked around to sit beside Maggie. Aren't you going to help me up? Daniel stared straight ahead. Apparently my wagon isn't good enough for you. Either get up here yourself or find your own way home. Maggie bit her lip to stifle the laugh that was bubbling up. Daniel wasn't going to put up with her sister's nonsense, and he was making that clear from the very beginning. Alison stood sputtering for a moment, but finally grabbed onto the wagon seat and hoisted herself up. She couldn't believe how rude Daniel was. Maggie's letters were all filled with what a wonderful man she'd married, and Alison couldn't believe anyone could see him that way. He wasn't a gentleman at all. She looked around her at the noisy city of St. Paul. "How often do you come to the city, Maggie? Will we come again soon?" She liked the idea of coming to a large city often. She was certain she'd be bored to death out in the middle of nowhere. Kippa hadn't been a big city, but at least she'd lived right in the middle of town. She had her friend, Ruth, and her school. Here, there was nothing. Maggie turned her head to look at her sister. "This is only the second time I've been here. The other time was when I came in on a train and met Daniel." She squeezed Daniel's arm to let him know she liked how he'd handled Alison. "They sell everything we need at the store in Hudspeth. Do you live close to Hudspeth?" If they lived close enough, maybe she could spend some time there. There had to be fun things for young people to do. It takes about an hour to drive there from the farm. We go every Sunday for church, of course, and I go into town once or twice a month for supplies. Once or twice a month? Tell me you're joking. Alison's voice had become a wail at the idea of being trapped on a farm. "So you only see each other and your kids?" Maggie stifled a laugh. "Daniel comes from a big family. I see his mother a couple of times per week, and his brothers and sisters and their families visit, or we visit them. I have the kids to keep me busy. I have a full life, but what am I going to do?" They were reaching the outskirts of town, but a man in a passing buggy turned his head at the tone of Alison's voice, which had gradually become louder and louder as she learned more about where she'd be living. "You're going to help your sister take care of the children and help with the chores. You're going to be a help and not a burden." Daniel's voice was soft but adamant. He wasn't going to let his sister-in-law run all over his wife just because she always had. "I hate chores. I never do chores, even ask Maggie." Alison's voice was pleading as she begged her sister to confirm her words. Maggie stayed silent as she waited for her husband to reply. "If you want to eat, you'll do chores. You have two choices. A nice warm bed inside the house where you eat 3 meals a day and you do chores, or a stall in the barn where you eat hay or grass." "Maggie, you can't let him talk to me that way. Tell him I get to stay in the house and eat and not do chores." Maggie turned to Alison. "He's my husband and you'll be living under his roof. You'll do as he says or you'll live in the barn. He's the head of my house. I think he's being very kind to let you come live with us at all." Alison's eyes widened. "You can't be siding with him. I'm going to write Mama, and she's going to insist you send me home right away. She won't let you treat me this way." Maggie had expected something of the sort to come up, so she'd come armed. She opened her string purse, which was resting on her lap, and pulled out her mother's last letter to her, which had arrived only yesterday. She didn't say a word as she handed it to Alison. The letter was short and to the point. "My dear Maggie, your father and I have made some terrible mistakes with your sister. We realize she's a handful and difficult to live with, and we will be forever grateful to you for taking her in. I know she's already 18, but please use whatever methods of discipline you need to use to ensure she acts politely and is helpful to you. She is not welcome back home until she has made some significant changes. Your father's heart cannot withstand another month like the last 2 have been. Kiss my grandbabies for me. All my love, Mama." By the time Alison was finished reading it, there were tears rolling down her face. She thinks I'm difficult to live with and I can't go back home? Alison had always been the favored daughter. She'd been given everything she wanted, even if it had meant her parents or her older sister going without. How could her mother say she wasn't welcome home until she made changes? What kind of changes? Maggie slipped her arm around her sister's shoulders, realizing the letter had been a huge blow to her. "I'm going to help you, Allie. I don't want to change." Alison realized she was whining, but she didn't care. Her whole world was crashing down around her. Her parents wouldn't let her come home. They'd told her she was coming out for a long visit while her papa recovered from his heart attack. Nothing was said about her having to stay away until she'd changed. Alison held herself stiffly as they drove along, thinking about what her mother could have meant. After half an hour had passed, Daniel pulled the wagon off the side of the dirt road and stopped next to a large pond. "I need to let the horses drink for a bit. Why don't you two set up the picnic?" He unhitched the team and led the horses to water to let them drink for a moment. He wanted to give the sisters some time alone to talk. Maggie went to the back of the wagon and pulled out a quilt and a picnic basket. "Will you help me set out lunch, please?" Alison nodded, not really wanting to, but feeling like she had no other choice at the moment. She helped Maggie spread out the quilt and opened the picnic basket. "I thought you said you packed sandwiches?" Maggie's brow furrowed. "I did." She looked in the basket. Instead of the sandwiches she'd fixed and wrapped in paper, there was a bowl full of fried chicken. Her milk jug full of water had been replaced by a jug of lemonade. She pulled out the plates and served each of them, putting potato salad on each of the plates. She watched as her sister automatically poured them each a glass of lemonade. At the bottom of the basket was a piece of paper folded in half. "I couldn't let you welcome your sister with sandwiches. Enjoy the chicken. Love, Millie." Maggie smiled. "Daniel's mother fixed us some fried chicken." "It's Daniel's favorite." Alison made a face. "He's nothing like you described him." "I don't like him at all." Maggie laughed softly. "You don't know him at all. He's a sweet, generous, loving man. You'll like his whole family. They welcomed me as soon as I stepped off the train. They may be nice, but he's not. He's welcoming you into his home when he doesn't have to. Please keep that in mind before you judge him." She saw over Alison's shoulder that he was coming back from the pond with the horses. He left them unhitched so they could graze while the three of them ate their lunch. He squeezed Maggie's shoulder as he sank down onto the quilt with them. He automatically bowed his head to pray. "Heavenly Father, thank you for sending Alison to us safely. We know she doesn't want to be with us, but please help her to understand the love we have for her. Help her to know that we only want what's best. We pray in the name of your precious Son. Amen." Maggie handed him his plate and fork. "This looks delicious. I can't believe you went to all this trouble." His eyes met Maggie's. He knew she'd been feeling sick in the mornings and hated she'd done so much for him when she was feeling so badly. Maggie grinned. "I didn't. Mama switched out the sandwiches I'd made for chicken." He laughed. "That's my mama." He took a big bite of the chicken and looked around for a napkin. Maggie had one dangling from her hand, anticipating him. Alison watched the two of them with a frown. Daniel hadn't been nice to her, but she could see that he loved Maggie. He was looking at her sister the same way Walter looked at Ruth. Even after Alison had thrown herself at him and kissed him, he'd still only had eyes for Ruth. She'd been so sure that if he'd known she was interested in him, Ruth would be forgotten. She thought wistfully of the bridesmaid dress her mother had made for her to wear to Ruth and Walter's wedding. She knew he'd take one look at her walking down the aisle in it and not care about Ruth anymore. Of course, she'd known that about the kiss too. Unfortunately, none of it would ever happen. Alison still couldn't believe Ruth would let a man come between them. They'd been friends since they were 6 years old. Alison snapped herself out of her reverie and ate her lunch. Daniel and Maggie had eyes only for each other. She felt as if she were all alone. What had she done to deserve this? Did God hate her that he was letting people treat her this way? Chapter 2. Alison let out a gasp of shock when she saw the remoteness of the farm. The odor of manure permeated the air and made her feel nauseated. How could Maggie stand it here? They were miles from the last town they'd driven through. Why would her sister choose to live in the middle of nowhere with a farmer? Daniel jumped down from the wagon seat and helped Maggie down and then came around to help Alison down. She gratefully took his hand this time, glad he'd obviously forgiven her for her snide remark about the wagon. The door opened and an older woman stepped onto the small front porch with a little girl on her hip. "How was the drive?" she called. Maggie walked to her mother-in-law and took the baby, kissing her daughter's cheek. "Thank you for the chicken, Mama. It was an unexpected treat." Millie's eyes twinkled. "I was happy to do it." She ruffled the head of the small boy beside her. "I'll return your bowl to you as soon as I wash it." She could feel Alison's presence behind her. "Mama, this is my sister, Alison." "Ally, this is Daniel's mother, Millie Stevens." Alison held out her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Stevens." Alison had always known how to act politely. When she wanted to make a good impression, she turned on the charm. She wasn't often concerned with making a good impression, though. "Welcome to Minnesota." Millie reached out and hugged the younger woman. "I'm happy to finally meet you." Maggie led the others inside. Once she was there, she could smell something cooking. "You didn't have to make dinner, but thank you. Will you and Papa join us?" Millie shook her head. "Your sister had a long ride. She doesn't want strangers around as she gets settled in." She nodded toward the oven. "It's done. I've got it in the oven to keep it warm. Take it out when you're ready to eat." "Were there any problems?" Maggie asked. How could there be problems with such wonderful grandbabies? Millie, like most grandmothers, felt her grandchildren could do no wrong and had no problem telling everyone they were perfect. Maggie laughed. "I can think of dozens of ways, but I'm glad it went well." Millie put her bonnet on. "I'm going to get Daniel to drive me home. I can see him waiting beside the wagon for me." She turned and smiled at Alison. "We're having a big dinner at my house to welcome you tomorrow evening. I'll see you then." Alison watched her go. "Does Daniel's family know that Mama and Papa sent me away?" She'd be mortified if they knew, so she really hoped the answer would be no. Maggie shook her head. "Of course not. We told them about Papa's heart attack and that you were going to come and stay with us while he recovered." Her house was small, but she was proud of it. "Let me show you around." The room they were in was self-explanatory. It was a combined living area, dining room and kitchen. "This is our room." Maggie opened a door to a bedroom with a large bed and a dresser. There was also a wardrobe and a rocking chair. Nothing else would fit. She opened the door beside it. "This is Helen's room. You'll be sharing with her." There was a small bed and a crib. A small wardrobe was there as well as a chest of drawers. Alison's eyes widened. She was expected to share a bedroom with a baby? She didn't say anything for fear of being offered a stall in the barn again. She swallowed hard. She wanted to go home more than anything. Maggie led her to a small, obviously newly built room off the back of the house. "This is Kenny's room." The room held a small bed and a dresser. That was the entire house. Alison couldn't believe the look of pride on Maggie's face. How could she be so proud of this tiny place? "It's nice," Alison fibbed. She couldn't come right out and tell her sister she lived in a hovel. Not after the way she'd been threatened by her brother-in-law. She blinked a few times to keep the tears from forming. She didn't want to live there. She wanted to go home to New York, where everything didn't smell like cow dung. Maggie opened the front door. "Daniel, put your bags on the porch. Why don't you unpack while I put dinner on the table? Daniel should be home in a few minutes." Maggie put the baby in her high chair as she went to work. Alison looked around for Kenneth. After a moment, she spotted him building something out of small wooden blocks in the corner. He didn't seem at all interested in meeting his aunt, so she went to the porch and carried in her bags, taking them to the small bedroom. She unpacked her things and put them away as best she could. There wasn't much room in the dresser because of all the baby's things. She went out into the large room and saw her sister setting the table. "How can I help?" Maggie stifled a grin as she thought about it. "Why don't you pour milk for us all?" She'd already set glasses down and she pointed at a large pewter pitcher on her work table. Alison poured the milk and set the pitcher back down. "Do you always eat this early?" The clock on the mantel showed that it was only 5:30. Maggie nodded. We're up at 5 to start the chores, so we go to bed early. We're all in bed by 8 most nights. Alison made a face. You don't really expect me to get up at 5, do you? Her sister may have chosen a farm life, but she certainly hadn't. The door to the outside opened then, and Daniel came in. My papa and brothers did the milking for me an hour ago. I'll feed the animals after supper, but most of my work for the night is done. Maggie smiled. Oh good. I'm glad you don't have to milk after driving all day. It hadn't occurred to Alison until that moment that her brother-in-law had put himself out to drive to St. Paul to get her. Thank you for picking me up, she said begrudgingly. He nodded to her. You're welcome. Alison found it felt good to thank him. She usually didn't thank people, because she assumed that doing things for her gave them pleasure. Maybe she'd have to try it more often. Daniel leaned down and kissed Helen on the cheek, and dropped to one knee with his arms spread. Alison wondered what he was doing until she saw a small blond boy barrel across the room and throw himself into Daniel's arms. I missed you all day, Papa. I helped Grandma with Helen, just like you said. Daniel smiled, hugging his little boy to him. Grandma said you were a big help. Thank you. Kenneth beamed at the praise. You were gone for a long time. Daniel nodded. We brought your Aunt Alison to live with us. Kenneth turned to Alison, looking up at her. Are you my aunt? Alison nodded. She hadn't spent much time around children and wasn't sure what to say. I'm your mama's sister. Kenneth's eyes grew wide. Like Helen is my sister? Alison nodded again. Kenneth watched her warily as he climbed into his chair at the table for dinner. Alison took that as her cue and sat beside him. Daniel and Maggie quickly took their seats as well. After the prayer, Kenneth took a spoonful of his casserole, still watching her. Alison looked at Maggie. I feel like a specimen at a zoo. Maggie laughed. He's not used to me having a sister. She looked at Kenneth. Kenny, you know how Aunt Faith and Aunt Patience are Papa's sisters? Kenneth nodded, not taking his eyes off Alison. Well, if Papa can have sisters, why can't Mama have one? Kenneth seemed to think about that for a minute. Papa always had sisters. You just got one today. No, baby. Mama has had Alison for her sister for 18 years. You just never met her because she lived so far away. Maggie's voice was calm and patient as she explained to her son. Kenneth shrugged, continuing his wary looks at Alison. Why is she here now? Maggie's eyes met Daniel's. Because your grandma and grandpa in New York needed her to come stay with us for a while. Grandpa in New York is sick, Daniel explained. Grandpa sick? Kenneth asked in alarm. Daniel shook his head. Not Grandpa here. Grandpa in New York. Kenneth looked confused. The grandma and grandpa here are Papa's mother and father. The grandma and grandpa in New York are Mama's parents. Daniel's voice sounded so much calmer than it had on the way home from St. Paul. Alison wondered if being around the children calmed him. Is New York far away? Alison nodded. Very far away. I had to take a train for days. Wow. A train? Kenneth's eyes widened in excitement. I want to go on a train. Alison smiled at her nephew. Maybe someday we can go on a train together. Kenneth got down from his chair and pushed it closer to Alison's and climbed back on. When can we go? Alison wasn't sure how to answer that. When you're big. Kenneth made a face. I'm big now. I'm a big brother. Alison laughed, despite the difficult day she'd had. She hadn't looked forward to having a niece and nephew, but now that she was here, she found herself charmed by the little boy. You are big, but someday you'll be bigger. Like your papa. Kenneth eyed his father. Tomorrow? Alison shook her head. No, in a few years. Kenneth pouted. No train for years? Alison looked to Maggie for help. Someday could be tomorrow or years. Eat your supper, Kenny. After supper, Maggie put the children in bed while Alison cleared the table. Daniel watched her as she moved around. She obviously knew how to do housework, she simply chose not to do it. "Can you cook?" Alison jerked at the sound of his voice. He'd been sitting so quietly she'd forgotten he was there. "No, I've never learned." Every time her mother had offered to teach her, she'd refused. She didn't want to learn to cook, because once she knew how, she knew she'd be expected to do it on a regular basis. "Maggie's an excellent cook. She can teach you." Alison felt her face turn red with anger. "I don't want to learn to cook. I don't want to have to clean or take care of kids. I just want to go home." She stomped off out the front door, leaving the dishes piled on the work table. Daniel heard Helen start wailing as soon as the door slammed. Maggie came out holding the fussy baby to her shoulder, looking exhausted. Daniel took the baby from her. "I'll get the baby to sleep. You go to bed. You need your rest." He didn't want to have to worry about her losing the baby. His sister Faith had lost two before she finally had her little girl. Maggie shook her head. "I can't leave you to deal with Alison, and I can't make her do the dishes alone on her first night here. She's got to be exhausted from her journey. We have to start out the way we intend to keep going. She needs to earn her keep here. She won't go to sleep until the dishes are done." He leaned down and pressed a quick kiss to her lips. "Go to bed. I'll be in when everything is settled out here." Maggie gave him one last worried look and headed for her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Through the door, she heard Daniel's soft baritone voice singing his favorite hymn to Helen. She always fell asleep immediately when Daniel sang to her. She slipped between the covers, determined to listen for what went on in the main room, but fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow. Daniel paced for a few minutes holding the baby and singing to her softly. It wasn't 5 minutes before she was sound asleep against his shoulder. He went into her room and slipped her into her crib, and patted her back for a moment when she started to lift her head. Once he was certain she was asleep, he went back out into the main room and picked up his Bible to read while he waited for his sister-in-law. She was going to pull her weight if it killed him. Maggie didn't need to be doing extra work to take care of her sister in her condition. Alison sat on the front step waiting for Daniel to come out and tell her she didn't have to learn to cook. She'd stormed off hundreds of times in her life, and it had always worked. Someone would come after her and she wouldn't have to do what she didn't want to do. She sighed, staring up at the stars. She wished Daniel would hurry. The stench of manure was making her sick. She shivered. It had been so nice out during the day, but now that it was dark out, it was cold. She couldn't stay out here much longer. What was keeping Daniel? Surely he knew she was cold. Why is he being so mean? It's so unfair. He expects me to cook and clean for his family. I didn't have the kids, so I shouldn't have to feed them. I'm a guest here, not a maid. She walked toward the barn, able to see it clearly by the light of the full moon. She opened the door cautiously and looked around. It was chilly in here too. She'd freeze if she had to sleep outside. And there was no way she could sleep in such a smelly place. She walked back toward the house, wondering if Daniel had come out to check on her while she was in the barn. Perhaps I should go and see? She opened the door. Daniel was sitting at the table reading his Bible. "Did you come outside to talk to me?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "Of course not. Are you ready to do the dishes now?" She sighed. "Why hasn't Maggie done them?" "Where's Maggie?" "She's asleep. She had a long day." "So did I. I'm going to bed, too." Daniel stood moving in front of the door to the room Alison would share with Helen. "Not until the dishes are done." "By myself?" Her voice started to rise again, both in volume and pitch. She'd never done dishes alone before. She'd always dried for her mother or Maggie, but they'd never made her actually put her hands in the water to do the dishes. There was always food in the water. Daniel folded his arms across his chest. "By yourself? What could he possibly be thinking? Didn't Maggie tell you I don't do dishes?" She must have. Alison fought to keep her voice calm. Maybe you haven't done dishes before, but you will from now on. You will not live in my house and eat my food without working. Alison stomped her foot. You can't make me. He shrugged. I can't make you do the dishes, but I can prevent you from sleeping or eating. From the way Maggie had described her sister, he'd expected a confrontation like this, but he hadn't expected it so soon. He'd been sure Maggie had exaggerated her sister's willfulness and self-centered attitude. She had obviously understated it instead. He mentally counted to 10 and watched her, waiting to see what she'd do. I can't sleep in the barn. It's cold outside and it stinks. She felt the tears fill her eyes. How can he treat me this way? His mother is so nice. How could she raise a man who could treat his own sister-in-law like this? The choice is yours. Do the dishes or sleep in the barn. Or wherever else you want outside. The barn is simply one option. I'm going to get a blanket from my room then. She made to move past him into the room, but he moved again, blocking her path. No. You're not. My house. My blankets. You'd actually force me to sleep in a cold smelly barn with no blankets? What kind of monster are you? Alison seriously thought about kicking him, but she wasn't sure what he'd do to her, so she restrained herself. What is wrong with you? How could Maggie have married him? I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm giving you two choices. You can either finish the dishes, or you can leave my house and sleep outside. You will not sleep here, or eat here, if you don't also work here. Daniel kept his voice calm as he explained everything. But that's not fair. Mama and Papa never made me work at home. You're not at home anymore. Your mama and Papa sent you away because you couldn't behave yourself at home. Dishes or outside? He was getting tired himself and wanted to crawl into bed with Maggie. How long was it going to take for her to realize she had to make a decision? Alison's lip started to quiver and big fat tears formed in her eyes. I don't want to sleep in the barn. Daniel pointed to the work table where she'd piled all of the dishes. Then it's time to get to work. Alison dragged her feet as she walked across the room. She heated up the dishwater as she'd seen her mother and Maggie do when she couldn't get out of wiping the dishes dry. She slowly washed each dish. When she had them all piled up, she turned around. There. The stupid dishes are clean. Are you happy now? I will be once they're dry and put away. He glanced up from his Bible as he said the words. He'd never seen anyone throw such a fit over such a small task. He watched Alison's face turn red with anger. For a minute he thought she might start throwing the clean dishes at him, but she whirled around and began drying them instead. She moved quickly and was finished in minutes. After she'd put everything away, she spun back around and glared at him. There. I'm done. He smiled and nodded. Thank you for doing the dishes, Alison. He stood up to bank the fire in the stove and put out the kerosene lights. Good night. Wait. Daniel had his hand on the doorknob to his bedroom when Alison's single word stopped him. Yes? I want to take a bath tonight. I need you to heat the water for me and carry it to my room. He laughed out loud. Tomorrow, you can take a bath. You know where the pump is, and you can heat the water for your own bath. Good night, Alison. Sleep well. Alison stood in the dark, staring at the door Daniel closed. How could Mama and Papa have sent me away to this kind of situation? Surely, they didn't know Daniel would treat me this way. I'll write them a letter tomorrow, and they'll send me a train ticket to come home. I know they will. She went into her room and undressed, put on her nightgown, and slipped into bed. Her prayer that night was simple. God, why have you forsaken me? Why would you let me end up in a place where I'm so mistreated? Please help me to go home to my parents who love me. In Jesus' name. Amen. She buried her face in her pillow and cried herself to sleep. Surely everything would be better tomorrow. Chapter 3. Alison woke up to the baby crying. It wasn't even light out. She groaned and put her pillow over her head to block out the noise. It's time to get up, Alison. Maggie's voice sounded chipper, despite the early hour. She took a diaper out of the dresser and took the baby out of her crib to change her. Alison groaned. Time to get up? What godforsaken hour did these people think was time to get up? She pulled the covers over her head and went back to sleep. Just because she lived on a farm didn't mean she had to get up with the chickens. When Daniel walked into the house after milking the cows, he found his wife cooking breakfast with both children sitting at the table. His sister-in-law was nowhere in sight. Helen was gnawing on a bread crust and Kenneth was jabbering on and on about nothing in particular. Where's Alison? Maggie shrugged. I told her it was time to get up, but I haven't seen her. He took the wooden spoon from Maggie's hand. I'll watch the eggs. Go get your sister up, please. You may want to stuff some cotton in your ears first. He shook his head at his wife. How could she make jokes about her sister's attitude? He was getting more frustrated by the minute with the girl. It was hard to believe they'd been raised by the same people. Maggie had married him expecting to work every day of her life. Alison expected to be waited on. It amazed him how different they were. It's not even light out yet. I'm not getting up. There are a lot of chores to be done. You need to get up now. Maggie's voice was soft but forceful. I won't. Maggie returned to the kitchen without her sister. What do you want me to do? She asked Daniel. Daniel returned the spoon to his wife, and filled a glass full of water from the bucket he'd just brought in from the well. He held it over Alison's head, and quietly gave her two choices. You'll get up now, or I'll dump this glass of water over your head. It's nice and cold. I just brought it in from the well. You wouldn't. He laughed. I don't make threats I'm not willing to carry out. He poured just a drop onto the back of her head, which was still buried in the pillow. She squealed. Fine. I'm getting up. Get dressed and get into the kitchen to help your sister with breakfast. He left the room and shut the door behind him. Alison threw the covers off and changed in a hurry. She swept her hand angrily over the back of her head. How dare he pour water on me? She stomped out into the big room and glared at Daniel while she asked Maggie, what do you need me to do? Breakfast is almost finished. Would you set the table for me, please? Alison sighed. At least Maggie phrased things as a question and didn't demand she do what she was told like Daniel did. She quickly set the table. Now what? Would you pour the milk for me, please? She poured milk into everyone's glass. She contemplated pouring the entire pitcher over Daniel's head, but knew if she did, she'd just be causing more problems for herself. She set the milk back onto the work counter with a bang. Anything else? Maggie handed her a large bowl of scrambled eggs as she carried a plate of toast and a plate of bacon. It's time to eat. Alison sat next to Kenneth again, who grinned at her. Are we going on a train today? Alison shook her head. Not today. Kenneth sighed. Maybe tomorrow. Daniel bowed his head to pray and everyone else followed suit. Even little Helen echoed his amen at the end of the prayer with her own babble. Maggie looked at Daniel. What are your plans for the day? We're all planting at Papa's today. Daniel's brothers and father grew wheat and corn. He was the only dairy farmer among them. They all planted and harvested together, going from one farm to the next. Of course, they helped Daniel with his animals when necessary and gave him part of their crops as payment. They helped at butchering time, and he provided his family with fresh meat. Will you be home for lunch? He shook his head. I'll be back around 4 to drive everyone over for supper tonight. Mama's going to feed us all lunch. How far away is your parents' house? Alison asked. She thought maybe, if Daniel continued being mean, she could sneak away and live with them. Daniel's mother was too kind to force her to work. It's about a mile. That's not far at all. Alison smiled to herself, happy she had a plan to get out of this place and away from Daniel. As soon as they were finished eating, Daniel left to go help his family plant the wheat. Alison breathed a sigh of relief as soon as he was gone. I'm going back to bed, she told Maggie as she stood and headed for her room. Maggie shook her head. You can't. Daniel's going to ask me later if you helped today, and if I tell him no, he's not going to let you stay here. Alison stomped her foot. Why does he think I need to work all the time? Because you live here, too. I always thought you should do more work at home, and I told you all the time. Alison nodded. Maggie had told her she should do more around the house, but she just hadn't listened to her. What do you want me to do? The words were spoken with animosity, because she knew she had no choice. Would you clear the table while I dress, Helen? And heat water to wash dishes? I'll wash, and you can dry. Alison sighed. At least I won't have to wash them again. She shuddered delicately. There was food all over those plates last night, and I had to touch it. Maggie stifled a laugh as she took Helen out of her high chair. You'll get used to it. Alison cleared off the table and pumped water into a pan to heat for the dishes. Kenneth watched her carefully. Why do you watch me so much? Kenneth shrugged. I never had an aunt live with me before. Alison decided to ignore him as she cleaned up. Maggie came out as she was pouring the water into the basin. Thanks, Alison. Maggie set Helen on the floor. Kenneth, play with your sister. Kenneth obediently got down from his chair and took Helen's hand, leading her to his blocks in the corner. Maggie rolled up her sleeves and made quick work of the dishes. I'm just going to fix some sandwiches for lunch, because we need to focus on what we're taking to Daniel's mother's house for supper tonight. I'm supposed to bring him meat and bread. I thought we could make some dinner rolls and a roast chicken. You're not really expecting me to help cook, are you? Alison's voice was exasperated as she asked. Yes, I am. I'll tell you how to do it, but you need to do the work. Once the dishes were done, Maggie swept the floor around the table. Go ahead and make your bed and straighten your room. We'll start cooking as soon as we're done with the cleaning. Alison went to her room and stared at the bed for a minute. She had made her bed at home, so this chore didn't seem outrageous to her. She quickly straightened the spread and picked up her clothes from yesterday from the floor. She wasn't sure where to put her dirty clothes, so she simply laid them aside. She went out into the main room, but Maggie wasn't finished sweeping, so she went into Kenneth's room and made his bed. When she returned to the kitchen, Maggie was taking down a huge bowl. I'm going to let you bake the dinner rolls. She put a sheet of paper with careful instructions onto the table. This is the recipe I use for bread. You're actually going to make 3 loaves of bread and 36 dinner rolls. This recipe is the right amount of everything you'll need for that. Just follow the instructions. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be working on the chicken. Maggie lit a lantern, opened the cellar door, which was next to the table, and climbed down the steep steps. She came back up, holding a raw chicken by the legs. She closed the cellar door and began prepping the chicken. Alison stood next to the table, reading over the instructions for the bread. It didn't look terribly difficult, so she began dumping ingredients into the big bowl Maggie had given her to use. She took the large spoon she had and started to mix it. Maggie? What does it mean to knead it? She'd heard the expression knead bread, of course, but she'd never actually done it or seen it done that she knew of. Maggie turned from the chicken. I basically means mixing it with your hands. Do you need me to show you? Alison's brows drew together. I think I've seen Mama do it. You kind of squeeze it between your hands and use the heels of your hands on it, right? She looked at the dough skeptically. She wasn't sure she wanted to get that messy. She reached out and took a handful of dough, feeling it squish between her fingers. You. Maggie laughed. You'll get used to it. She washed her hands quickly before putting her hand into the flour and spreading some out on the table. It's easier if you knead it on the table and not in the bowl. Alison worked her hands through the dough for several minutes while Maggie watched. You're doing great. Alison just made a face but kept going. Finally, Maggie told her, that's probably enough. She poured oil into the bowl and picked up the clump of dough Alison had made, coating it for her with the oil. There. Now we'll let it rise. Alison had dough all over her face and even some flour in her hair. While it's rising, why don't you heat water for your bath? Daniel brought in several buckets full from the well this morning, because it's easier to get a lot from the well than the pump. She poured a bucket into a huge pot. Alison moved the pot onto the stove. She'd seen the bathtub outside leaning up against the house. I'll go get the tub. Her father had always filled her tub with water before, but she certainly understood how it needed to be done. Where should I put it? In my room. It won't fit at yours. Alison carried the tin tub into Maggie's bedroom and put it at the foot of the bed. There was barely enough room for it. She heated up 6 buckets of water and carefully dumped them into the tub. She took a long leisurely bath, thankful for the time alone to just relax. When she was finished and dressed again, she carefully emptied the tub and went back into the kitchen. You need to knead the dough one more time, and then we'll let it rise again. Maggie was sitting in one of the 2 rocking chairs knitting something. Alison sighed. Cooking is hard work. Maggie nodded. It is, but it's gratifying. I love to watch my family enjoy what I've worked so hard on. Alison pulled the dough out of the bowl and kneaded it. She'd had to wet braid her hair, because she was certain no one would appreciate her waiting to do anything until it was dry. Once the bread was kneaded, she put it back in the bowl and recovered it with the towel. Now what? Wash your hands before you do anything else. Alison looked down at her dough-covered hands and went to the basin to wash them. Is there more for me to do? Maggie smiled. There's always more work to do on a farm. She thought for a minute. I have a basket of mending next to the other rocker. Would you mind darning the socks that are in there for me? Alison dragged her feet as she went to the sewing basket. Maggie knows I hate mending. Is she just determined to make my life miserable while I'm here? She picked up the mending basket and started on the first sock, a tiny one that must belong to Helen. She had yet to see Helen in shoes, so could only guess these were for church. By the time Daniel returned home to take them to his parents' house, Alison was worn out. Other than her bath, she'd done nothing but chores all day. She'd mended socks, made beds, done dishes, and made bread. She had to admit, if only to herself, smelling her own baking made her feel like she'd accomplished something. All the dinner rolls she'd made were in a basket she planned on carrying into the party herself. She'd quickly changed into her favorite dress, a mint green that went well with her red hair and her green eyes. She put her hair into a loose bun on top of her head, feeling that she looked her best. Walking out of her bedroom, she saw everyone waiting for her. Are you ready? Maggie asked softly. I think so. Do I look okay? You look beautiful as always, Maggie told her. Daniel picked Helen up and Maggie took the platter the chicken was on, covered with a cloth. Little Kenneth followed behind. Alison picked up the basket of dinner rolls and followed the others out the door. Daniel didn't bother to lock the door, which shouldn't have surprised Alison, but it did. In the country, they must not have to worry about things like that as much, she thought. Alison held little Kenneth while they drove to Millie's house. It was the first time she'd held one of the children and it felt strange to her. He leaned against her and chatted happily about his cousins and how fun it was going to be to go to Grandma's house and play. She didn't feel the need to respond as he was talking nonstop, and there was really no opportunity to do so anyway. They pulled up in front of a house that was much bigger than Daniel and Maggie's. With the number of siblings Daniel had, she was sure the house had grown a lot over the years. Daniel took Helen and set her on the ground before helping Maggie down. Then he did the same with Kenneth and Alison. Alison thanked him politely, knowing if she didn't, he'd probably act mean, and she didn't want that to happen in front of other people. Millie came out of the house and scooped Helen up in her arms, hugging her as if it had been months since she'd seen her instead of just the day before. Alison took her basket of dinner rolls and carried them into the house, putting them on the large table in the center of the big room. Looking around, she realized the layout was almost the same as Daniel's house, but it had been added onto more times than Daniel's had. She was certain after Maggie had given birth a few more times, their house would be just as big. Millie took Alison's arm and introduced her to the two men who were lounging at the table eating a plate of cookies that was sitting out. "This is my youngest son, Frank, and my second youngest, Eddie." Frank was leaning back in his chair and jumped to his feet once he caught sight of Alison. "It's nice to meet you." Frank had dark hair and green eyes. Alison could tell he was interested in her and decided living in Minnesota might be better than she'd realized. "It's nice to meet you," she said in a soft voice. She'd learned long ago to use a soft voice when she first met a man rather than screeching at him. Eddie sighed and nodded at her. Obviously Frank was staking claim on the new girl in town. There just weren't enough women to choose from in the area. "Would you like to go out in the yard and talk before supper?" Frank asked Alison. Alison turned to Millie first. "Is there anything you need me to do to help with dinner, Mrs. Stevens?" She knew offering to help and being polite to his mother would form a good impression on Frank. Millie shook her head, delighted at the idea of Frank courting someone, especially Maggie's sister. She loved Maggie as a daughter, and would be thrilled to have her sister in the family as well. Alison turned back to Frank and nodded, keeping her eyes down to feign shyness. "I'd be happy to." Frank offered his arm to her, and she took it. He led her out to the yard and they walked slowly around. "What do you think of Minnesota so far?" Alison shrugged. "I haven't seen much of it. St. Paul seemed interesting as we drove through it. It's certainly beautiful here. Not to mention smelly and boring, but she wasn't about to mention that." Frank smiled down at her. He was well over 6 feet. She loved how tall and strong he looked. "I've never been out of Minnesota, but I can't imagine any place on earth being prettier." Alison smiled. "You should see the ocean. It's so amazing to stand next to it. It's a place you can truly feel the awesome power of God." "So you're a Christian?" "Of course. Maggie and I were both raised in the church." "Do you know how long you'll be in Minnesota?" She shook her head. "I'm not sure. Papa needs to get better before I can go home. It's too much having me there with him being so sick." She didn't add that she had caused a lot of problems at home. Why would she? She wanted to make a good impression. "I'll probably be here at least through the end of the year. Would you mind if I asked Daniel for permission to court you?" She looked down, because she hadn't been able to figure out how to force a blush. "I think I'd like that." The call came then for everyone to go inside for dinner, so she walked demurely back toward the house. She took a seat beside Frank and listened as Daniel's father, George, led the family in prayer. She was surprised when he thanked God for bringing her into their lives and asked that he would help her feel at home with their family. She watched everyone as they ate their meal, enjoying the loud happy family. There was a lot of teasing and joking going on around her. Her dinner rolls disappeared quickly, and she had to bite her lip to keep from announcing she'd made them. A woman who cooked a lot wouldn't brag about something like that, would she? She didn't want Frank to know she'd never cooked anything in her life before that day. Frank watched Alison out of the corner of his eye, thrilled to have met the young woman. She was everything he was looking for in a wife as far as he could see. She was pretty, a Christian, and soft-spoken. So far, he liked everything he saw. He'd have to find a way to corner Daniel after dinner. He should ask her father for permission to court her, but with his health issues, he didn't think it was a good idea. Besides, he didn't want to have to wait for a letter to come back from New York. After supper, the women stayed in the house to do the dishes and clean up, while the men went outside and talked. Frank saw Daniel talking to their papa out by the barn, so he headed over to talk to his brother. "Excuse me, Papa. I'd like to talk to Daniel for a minute." He was speaking more formally than usual, he realized, but he'd never formally asked anyone for permission to court a girl before. George nodded and wandered away, a slight grin on his face. "I want to ask your permission to court Alison." Daniel stifled a laugh. He wondered if his brother had any clue what he was getting into. "I don't think that's a good idea right now." He wasn't going to malign Alison, but he couldn't imagine his younger brother being able to handle such a headstrong young woman. Frank narrowed his eyes in anger. "I know you think I'm still a kid, but I'm not. I'm 26 years old. Daniel shook his head. It's not you I'm worried about. It's Alison. At this point, I don't think she'd make anyone a good wife. How dare you say that? She's beautiful and sweet. Daniel shrugged. You know what? You can court her, but when she breaks your heart, don't come crawling to me. He turned on his heel and walked away from Frank. If his brother wasn't willing to listen to reason, then he wasn't going to argue with him. His brother could deal with the brat. Chapter 4. Frank met Daniel's wagon on Sunday morning and he helped Alison down. I'd like to introduce you around if you don't mind. Alison smiled up at him. I'd love that. Frank wouldn't even look at Daniel as he placed Alison's hand on his arm and walked with her to the church. Would it be all right with you if I came by this evening? He asked. Mom is having the whole family over for Sunday lunch today, and then after, I thought I could come over and we could spend some time walking and talking. Alison nodded in what she hoped was a shy manner. I'd like that a lot. Frank introduced Alison to several of his single friends. His nephew Charlie came over and shook her hand. I met you the other day, but Frank was hogging all your attention. I'm Charlie. She smiled at him. Hi, Charlie. Patience is my mother, Charlie told her helpfully. She mentally went through the list of Frank's siblings and placed Patience as the oldest of the bunch. Charlie looked too old to be Patience's son, but she didn't say anything. After he'd walked away, Frank whispered that Charlie was actually her stepson. Patience had married his father when Charlie was 8. I see. Slowly, Frank introduced her to all the people he knew in the church. When it was time for the first hymn, he took her over to her sister and she sat down with Daniel, Maggie, Helen and Kenneth. Daniel held Kenneth on his lap and Maggie held Helen. Alison stood with the others and sang the hymns with a strong clear voice. She loved singing in church, because she was fully aware she couldn't carry a tune, and church was the only acceptable outlet for her to sing in public. After church, she found Millie and asked if she could speak with her privately. Millie smiled at her and led her to a private spot at the side of the church. How are you settling in? Alison sighed heavily, forcing a tear to her eye. She'd learned to cry on command years before. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I'm having a hard time at Daniel's house. He's been really mean to me. He expects me to cook and clean and help with the children. I'm not sure why he thinks I came out here to be a servant, but I'm certain that's not what my parents intended when they suggested I come here. She paused for emphasis, wiping the lone tear from her eye. I was wondering if I could come and stay with you. Millie studied the girl with her bowed head. She'd sensed something wasn't right when Alison was there for dinner on Friday, and now she understood. So you want to move in with me so you don't have to do any work and can be treated like a house guest? Because that's really what you are? Alison nodded, not meeting Millie's eyes. Yes, ma'am. Millie almost laughed. The girl was putting on a good act. Well, let me tell you how it would be in my house, and you can decide where you want to be. You'd get up before dawn to help me cook breakfast. After breakfast, we'd do the dishes together and spend the day in various chores around the house, including cooking meals and delivering them to my grown sons who are unmarried and who live outside the house. We'd also spend some time visiting some of the sick who can't make it to church, cooking meals for them, and often cleaning their homes for them, because it's so hard to do for themselves. At least 3 days a week, I'm visited by one of my children who bring their children and I help with them while they're there. You'd be expected to help with that as well. I do a lot of sewing for the needy. I make clothes for my husband and myself as well as my grown sons, and often sew quilts and special gifts for my grandchildren. Alison sighed and met Millie's eyes. In other words, you'd work me just as hard as Daniel does? Millie nodded, her eyes twinkling. That's what we do. We work. No one is going to let you sit on your backside reading books or daydreaming. She paused for emphasis. I'm not sure what it was like for you back in New York, but I assure you, we don't have time for lollygagging here. But it's not fair that I should have to do all that work for someone else's children. Do you really think it's fair that you're adding to the food eaten in the household and adding to the workload without doing anything to help? Millie picked up a Bible that was lying on a pew beside her. She quickly flipped through the pages to 2 Thessalonians. She handed the Bible to Alison. "Would you read chapter 3 and verse 10 out loud, please? For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat." Alison looked up at Millie. "But that doesn't mean working for others." Millie gave Alison a stern look. "It means what it says. If you're not willing to work, then you shouldn't eat. Whether you think it's fair or not, it's a Christian's job to work." End of story. Daniel and Maggie are providing you with a home when you wouldn't have one otherwise. They're feeding you and keeping you warm. The least you can do is show your appreciation by helping out as much as you can around the house. Alison sighed. "I guess I need to stay where I am." Millie nodded. "I guess you do. Doing for others brings me great joy." "What brings you joy?" "I don't know. I guess I'm not a very happy person most of the time." She'd never really thought of that before, but once she said the words, she realized they were true. She wasn't happy. She'd never really been happy. "I didn't think so." "Try doing for others and see how you feel afterward. I promise you, it will make you feel good about yourself." Millie returned the Bible to where she'd found it. Her eyes met someone's over Alison's head. "I think my son is eager to see you." Alison looked over her shoulder to see Frank watching her. "You won't tell him what I said, will you?" Millie shook her head, squeezing Alison's arm. "Of course not." Alison smiled at the older woman and turned to take the arm Frank was offering her. As he led her out to the wagon, he smiled. "I'm glad you're getting to know my mama. I want you two to get along. She seems like a very wise woman." "She is." He took her hand and helped her onto the seat beside Maggie. "I'll see you in a few minutes at lunch." Alison turned to Daniel after Frank walked away. "Couldn't I ride with Frank?" Daniel shook his head. "There's no time to arrange a chaperone. Maybe next week, we can plan that ahead of time." Alison stared in disbelief at Daniel. "You won't let me even drive to your parents' house with him without a chaperone? Even if we're right behind you in his wagon?" "I'm afraid not. There are lots of nephews and nieces around who would be thrilled to chaperone you, though." Alison folded her arms over her chest. She could do what she wanted. She was 18. Why did everyone persist in treating her like a child? Frank ate supper with Daniel's family and patiently waited until after Alison had helped Maggie with the dishes, before he offered his arm and led her outside. It was growing dark, so he took a lantern from the house. Before leaving, he met Daniel's eyes. "We'll stay within sight of the house at all times." He was still angry with his brother, but he wasn't going to compromise Alison in any way. Daniel nodded briefly and held Kenneth on his lap, telling him a story as he tried to settle him down for bed. As soon as they were away from the front door, Alison suggested they go for a walk. "Of course. We just have to make sure we're always within sight of the house." Alison shook her head. "No, we don't. Let's walk up the road a while. It's such a beautiful night." She was wearing a light shawl over her dress, but was plenty warm enough. "I love springtime." Frank led her over to the barn. "I respect my brother too much to lead you too far from the house. We need to stay where he can see us by glancing out the window." Alison narrowed her eyes. "Why? It's not like we're going to do anything wrong if we can't be seen." Frank raised an eyebrow at the temper Alison was starting to show. "Because it's the right thing to do." "Why is it the right thing to do?" "Because Daniel says so." "Is Daniel the ruler of your world?" "No, but as long as you live under his roof, we'll follow his rules. Besides, I agree with him. I don't think a courting couple should be without a chaperone or out of sight of others." Alison stomped her booted foot in the grass. "I think that's downright silly. I wouldn't do anything wrong, and I trust you to not do anything wrong. I want to go for a walk away from the house. I'm sorry, but I respect my brother and you too much for that." Alison turned on her heel and started walking away. Frank half ran to catch her next to the fence. "Where are you going?" I'm going for a walk. I know you won't let me walk alone, so you'll go with me. Do you really think you can be that stubborn with me? Where was the sweet girl he'd met Friday night and introduced around at church just that morning? He opened the gate for the corral, knowing Daniel had put the horses in the barn for the night. He pulled her into the corral with him, hoping it would keep her from storming off. I can do anything I want to do. You can't control me, and neither can your brother. Frank understood now what Daniel had meant about Alison not being ready to court anyone. Right now, you're in my care. You're going to stay here with me near the house where we can be seen. She crossed her arms over her chest, utterly furious with him for telling her what to do. And if I don't? Frank blinked for a moment, not believing she was speaking to him this way. I'll stop you. She laughed. I'd like to see you try. With that she spun around and started walking away again. Frank caught her by the hand, scooped her up into his arms, and did the only thing he could think to do to calm her temper. He picked her up and dropped her straight into the horse trough. I hope that water is enough to cool your temper. Alison came up sputtering. I can't believe you just did that to me. I hate you. She ran toward the house and quickly shut the door behind her. Maggie looked up and immediately covered her mouth with her hand. Oh my. What happened to you? Alison stomped her foot. That mannerless oaf just threw me in the horse trough. Daniel looked at his sister-in-law, soaked from head to toe. Her church dress was wet and covered with mud. Her red hair, which had been perfectly arranged, was hanging around her face in clumps. Go get dried off, before you catch your death. Alison threw open the door to her room and slammed it shut. She changed into her nightgown and flung herself down on her bed, sobbing. How could he do that to me? What is wrong with him? She cried herself to sleep, wondering if her life would ever be good again. Chapter 5. Alison's eyes were red-rimmed the following morning when she came into the kitchen to help with breakfast. Maggie felt badly for her sister, but after talking with Frank about what had happened the night before, she knew her sister had deserved the treatment she'd gotten. She was only thankful the temperature had been mild and Alison wouldn't get sick from the treatment she'd received. Maggie saw Frank ride up on his horse as they were finishing up the breakfast dishes. There were only 2 dishes left to be dried, so she offered to do them. Go on out and talk to Frank. I'll finish up here. Alison's heart leapt when she saw him through the window. She removed her apron and went outside to wait for her apology. She stood on the porch and watched as he dismounted and walked to her, his hand holding the reins. I wanted to talk to you now that we'd both had time to cool off, Frank began. Alison nodded slowly. I'm glad you came, she told him honestly. I just want to tell you when you're ready to grow up and respect yourself as much as I respect you, I'll be waiting. You just let me know when you're ready for a real relationship, one that will be pleasing to God, and I'll come back around. Alison's eyes widened with surprise. You're not here to apologize? He shook his head. I'm not sorry for what I did. I've come to care for you, Alison, but I can't let you act that way. He got onto his horse and looked into her eyes. I'll be waiting. She stood and watched him ride away. What just happened? Did he really leave without apologizing? Alison walked back into the house in a daze. She couldn't believe he had left without apologizing, but still had told her he'd be waiting. What do I need to do to make him see I'd make him a good wife? Maggie was waiting inside the house. We need wash the clothes today, and I'm going to need your help. Maggie's hand went to her stomach. I'm not feeling well this morning, and I'm not sure how much I can do on my own. The diapers especially. Alison made a face. Maggie and Daniel had announced at lunch the previous day that Maggie was carrying their 3rd child. She had heard that pregnancy made a woman queasy in the mornings, so she knew what Maggie was asking. I'll help. The words were grudging, but they were there. Thank you, Ally. Alison's eyes met Maggie's. He didn't come back to apologize. Maggie shook her head. He told us what happened last night. I didn't think he was here to apologize. He said when I was ready to grow up and respect myself, he'd be waiting for me. Her green eyes were full of hurt. What does that mean? Maggie slipped her arm around her sister's shoulders and led her to the table. He means that when you're willing to start following rules and acting like one of God's servants, He'll be here for you and you can have a relationship. I don't understand. No one at home had any problem with me, and now I'm here and everyone acts like nothing I do is right. Alison was truly bewildered. Her whole life everyone had acted like it was their pleasure to serve her. Well, her parents and her friend, Ruth, had. She didn't understand what was so different about Minnesota. Maggie took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to reach her sister. I always had a problem with how you acted. You seemed to think everyone was put on earth to serve you. She paused, not wanting to hurt Alison, but knowing she needed the words she was about to say. They weren't. We're all God's servants, or we're supposed to be. We're here to do what He wants, not what Alison wants. You need to start looking for ways to help others. But how? You need to start thinking of other people first. Everyone starts out entirely selfish. You cry and someone comes running to change you or to feed you. Every need is taken care of by someone else. Most people outgrow that. You never have. You have always been the most important person in your world. God needs to be the most important person to you. Once He is, everything else is going to fall into place. But how does that happen? Maggie stood and went to the shelf where Daniel kept the family Bible. You start here. You read the Bible every free minute you have. I know you feel like you have no free time now, but you really do. I find time for Bible study while the kids are sleeping or while I'm waiting for my bread dough to rise. So many times during the day I spend 10 minutes reading the Word or praying. Before you open your mouth, say a quick prayer to God. When you start to get angry, ask God how He wants you to handle things. She clenched her sister's hand. The most important thing you can do now is build a relationship with God. Everything else will follow. Will you help me? Alison felt the tears running down her face. Do people really see me that way? Maggie bit her lip as she studied her sister. I'll try. Most of it has to come from you. I'll remind you when I can. Alison stood up determined to make the changes she needed to make to not only be attractive to Frank, but to be a better person. If you'll tell me what to do, I'll do the laundry. I've noticed how tired you've been. She shrugged. If I knew how to do it myself, I would. Maggie smiled. I appreciate the offer. I'll help you with it, but maybe, if I'm feeling bad next week, you could do it yourself. Alison nodded. I'd be happy to. She knew she should be happy to do it, so she worked hard to get there. She would be happy to help others someday. It may not come easily, but it would come, she hoped. The children played in the grass around them as Maggie taught Alison to wash the clothes. She'd seen them hung on the line enough that she knew how to do that part of it. When it was lunchtime, Alison was the one to go down into the cellar to get the things they'd need for a cold lunch of leftover meat and bread with butter. Daniel was working at Eddie's farm that day helping with the planting, so he wasn't coming home for lunch. After lunch, Maggie rocked Helen to sleep while Alison washed and dried the dishes herself. Once Maggie was in her crib, and Kenneth was sleeping in his bed, Alison turned to Maggie. What do we need to do this afternoon? Maggie stifled a yawn. We need to bake bread again. We need fresh bread for supper. I'm going to start a soup now, and then we'll bake the bread. I was thinking of making a cake for dinner as well. If you'll start the soup, I'll make the bread. I did it the other day, so I know what I'm doing now. You take a nap. And get me the recipe for cake. I can do that, too. Maggie looked at her sister wondering if she could manage. Are you sure? It would mean you chopping vegetables, making the bread, and baking the cake. Alison nodded. Just tell me what to do and when, and I'll get it done. Maggie started the soup, and sat down at the table. She wrote out quick instructions for Alison with a time for everything. Hugging her sister, she whispered, "Thank you." She went to bed unsure if dinner would be cooked correctly, but knowing Alison would do her best for a change. Alison followed the directions exactly. When Helen woke from her nap, she changed her diaper and put the little girl in her chair with a snack of raisins. When Daniel got home, Alison was sitting at the table folding the laundry she'd just brought in from the line. Helen was sitting in her chair eating raisins, and Kenneth was playing with his blocks. He could smell a cake baking and saw the freshly made loaves of bread. "Where's Maggie?" Alison looked up. "She was exhausted, so I told her to take a nap." Daniel looked around at the clean house. He took in the soup simmering on the stove and noted the freshly folded laundry. If Maggie had brought the laundry in, she'd have put it away before lying down. "Thank you for all the work you've done today." Alison felt as if she'd been handed a treasure. It was rare for her to do something she would be thanked for. "You're welcome." Millie had been right. It did feel good to do things for others. Alison put away the clothes that she could without waking Maggie. When she came out of Kenneth's bedroom, Daniel was sitting in a chair rubbing his neck. "How long has Maggie been asleep?" Alison looked at the clock. "She went to bed around 1, I think." Daniel's eyes widened in alarm. "That was 4 hours ago. I'm going to go make sure she's okay." He slipped into the bedroom with Maggie. She was just sitting up. "Why are you already home?" she asked groggily. "It's 5. Are you okay?" He sat down beside her on the bed. "You're not sick, are you?" She shook her head. "Just tired. This pregnancy is hitting me harder than the others. Probably because I have 2 little ones this time." She stretched and climbed out of bed. "I'd better go get the clothes off the line and make sure Alison didn't burn everything." Daniel stopped her with a hand on her arm. Alison got the clothes off the line, folded them, and put all but the clothes that go in here away. "Dinner smells great. The kids are happy." He paused, a baffled look on his face. "What happened to her?" Maggie smiled, putting her arms around him and burying her face in his shoulder. "Frank came by this morning." She went outside fully expecting an apology, but he told her when she was ready to grow up and respect herself, he'd be waiting. She sighed, pushing her hair from her face. She didn't understand what he meant, so I talked to her about how she acts like a small child, expecting everyone around her to do everything for her. I talked to her about being a servant of God and what it means. She seems to truly want to change. Daniel made a face. "We'll see if that happens." Maggie frowned at him. "You need to help her, not act as if she can't do it. We both need to be supportive." Daniel sighed. "You're right. If I act like I expect her to fail, it will just help her fail. I need to act like I'm sure she'll do the right thing, and then she will. I don't expect this to be an overnight thing. I'm sure we'll see a lot more tantrums out of her, but at least she's making an effort." They walked into the kitchen to see Alison setting the table. She had the cake sitting on the counter cooling. "I didn't know how to make frosting." "Were you going to make frosting for it?" she asked Maggie. Maggie shook her head. "I was just going to make whipped cream to serve on it." "Okay. Will you show me how so I can do it next time?" "Absolutely. Thank you for working so hard and letting me nap." "It was my pleasure." She pointed to the clothes she'd stacked on the rocker in the corner. "I couldn't put those away." Maggie hurried to the rocker. "I'll put them away now." Once the clothes were put away, she sliced the bread for dinner. "You're getting really good at baking bread. This came out perfectly." Alison beamed with pleasure. "Thanks. I followed the recipe exactly." After dinner, Alison didn't wait to be asked, but immediately got up to start heating the water for the dishes and cleared the table. By the time Maggie got the children in bed, all of the dishes were put away and the room had been swept. Maggie stared around her in awe. "Everything looks wonderful. Thank you so much." Alison couldn't believe how good it felt to be thanked for something she'd done. "Is there anything else you need me to do this evening?" "Nothing. I'm making a meal for an elderly couple from church tomorrow, and I clean their house while I'm there. I can leave the kids with you, and go by myself, or we can take the kids to Daniel's mom and we can go help them together." "Which would you prefer?" Alison thought about it for a moment. I'd like to go with you. It would be nice to do something for them. Maggie smiled. I'd like that. Millie is used to me dropping them off on Tuesdays after lunch, so she'll be expecting us. So what will we do for dinner tomorrow? I usually make Tuesdays a bean night. I'll soak the beans now, and we'll boil them in the morning while we do our chores. Then I'll keep them hot in the oven. When we get home, I'll whip up a quick cornbread and we'll be set. Will you teach me? Of course. Maggie pulled open the trapdoor for the cellar and took the lantern from the table. You shouldn't be going up and down those steep stairs in your condition. Just let me know what you need, and I'll do it. Alison took the lantern from Maggie and waited. There are some empty quart jars down there. Fill one up from the barrel of beans and bring it up. I'll also need some salt pork. Alison nodded and descended the stairs, coming back up with what Maggie had asked for. Maggie showed Alison how to soak the beans. Now we just need to cook them in the morning. Alison looked to the shelf for the Bible, because she wanted to spend some time reading it that evening, and saw that it wasn't there. Daniel had it. She didn't want to ask him for it, so she turned toward her room. Alison? She turned at Daniel's voice. Would you care to listen as Maggie and I do our Bible reading this evening? We usually do it as soon as we have both children in bed and the chores are done. We've missed the past few nights. I'd like that if you don't mind. She looked at Maggie to make certain her sister was okay with it. Maggie smiled and indicated the chair beside her as she sat down at the table. Daniel said a quick prayer for them and began reading. Alison listened intently, wanting to improve her relationship with God so she could become a better person. She'd thought about Maggie's words all day as she worked. There had been a lot of people who had avoided her back in New York. At the time, she'd chalked it up to jealousy, but she understood better now. It wasn't jealousy. It was simply that no one had wanted to be around her, and she could understand why now. She needed to start thinking of others first. It was a simple concept, but not so simple to live by. She could do it, though. She knew she could. Chapter 6. Alison found her week passed in a blur as she worked side by side with Maggie. 2 afternoons were spent helping various people in the community, and she helped Maggie at home the other days. Maggie napped when she could, and Alison learned more about cooking than she ever thought she would. By the time Sunday rolled around, she was almost afraid to go to church. She'd gone to church every Sunday of her life, and had always considered herself a good Christian. She was just now learning what being a true follower of Christ meant, though. She felt like she'd been a hypocrite for her entire life. She dressed and went outside to the wagon where Daniel helped her on. She held Kenneth in her lap again, this time enjoying his chatter, because it kept her mind off seeing Frank again. She hated that Frank had been right. She didn't want to have to face him and apologize. She'd never apologized for her bad behavior before, and she wasn't looking forward to it now. When Daniel pulled up into the churchyard, Alison's eyes quickly scanned the crowd for Frank. She really wanted to avoid him, but knew it was her place to seek him out and apologize for her behavior. Maggie had helped her see he was being respectful to her by asking her to remain within sight of others at all times. Daniel took Kenneth from Alison. Before he could offer his hand to help her down, Frank's hand was offered. Her eyes met his and she grasped his hand, mumbling her thanks. He offered his arm as if nothing had happened between them. They were halfway to the church before she stopped and turned to him. I want to apologize for my behavior. I wish I had an excuse for the way I treated you, but I don't. Will you forgive me? Frank's eyes searched hers, trying to decide if she was being sincere or not. She'd seemed so sweet to him, and then suddenly turned into a spoiled brat. Now, she seemed to be turning back into the sweet woman he'd first met. Who was she really? He nodded quickly. Of course, I forgive you. She smiled up at him, genuinely pleased. Thank you. She wanted to ask if he was ready to court her again, but she didn't feel like she had the right to push anything. She'd simply wait and see what happened. He turned and walked her to the church again, talking to her politely of his week. She knew that 2 days of the week Daniel had been at his house helping with the planting. "Did you get your crops in?" He nodded. "Everything's planted. Now I just have to make sure it all grows." She knew very little about a farmer's life. "So you can pretty much rest until fall now, right?" He laughed. "You didn't grow up in a farming town, did you?" She shook her head, embarrassed by her lack of knowledge about the subject. "Honestly, I know nothing about farming, I can tell." His laughter was good-natured, so it didn't put her on edge like it usually did when someone laughed at her. "I'll spend the summer weeding the fields and making sure the bugs don't eat all my crops. If we don't get enough rain, I'll have to water everything." "How do you make sure the bugs don't eat everything?" He shrugged. "I check them often. If I find a large section is being eaten up, I'll burn just that section to keep them from spreading. Sometimes if it's only a bug or two, I drop the insect into a can of gasoline." "Why do you have gasoline?" "I buy it just to put the bugs in. I'm thinking of buying a tractor, though. I could get so much more work done with one. I'm trying to talk Papa and my brothers into splitting the cost with me, and we'd all take turns with it. It would help us get the work done so much faster." Alison nodded, liking the idea. "I think that would be a good investment. I wish Papa and my brothers were as easy to convince." She took her seat with Maggie and her family and worked hard at paying attention to the sermon instead of daydreaming as she usually did. The sermon was about having a servant's heart, and Alison couldn't help but wonder if someone had talked to the pastor about her. She hoped not, but it wouldn't truly surprise her. After all, she deserved to be rebuked for the way she'd treated people all her life. Once the service was over, she watched as Daniel made a beeline for Frank. She did her best not to watch them. Her first thought was they were talking about her, but she was rapidly learning the world didn't center around Alison. Once they were home, Alison descended into the cellar to get the leftovers from dinner the previous evening. She and Maggie had made a huge pot of chicken and dumplings, so there would be enough to serve after church. When she came back out of the cellar, carrying the covered pot, she hurried to the stove to reheat the meal. She slipped her apron over her Sunday dress as soon as the pot was on the stove. Maggie was changing Helen, so she set the table herself, setting out fresh bread and butter. She poured milk into each glass and went back to stir the chicken and dumplings, to make sure it wouldn't burn. She put fresh butter on the table. Kenneth came over and pulled on her skirt, so she looked down at him. "I'm hungry." She smiled, and quickly took a piece of the bread she'd cut up and placed on the table, slathered it with butter and handed it to him. "There. We'll be eating in a few minutes, so that's all you get for now." "Okay?" "Thanks, Aunt Ally." "You're welcome." She hurried back to the stove to stir the food one more time as Maggie came out of her bedroom with Helen trailing behind her. Maggie quickly tied her apron and looked around her. "There's nothing left for me to do, is there?" She patted Alison's shoulder. "You've been a big help to me this past week." "Thank you." Alison smiled brightly. "Would you watch the food while I run to the cellar? I want to serve some jam with this." "Absolutely. Kenneth will love you forever if you serve jam." Alison opened the trapdoor again and retrieved the jam. When she popped her head out, she saw everyone was already at the table. Her eyes widened when she realized Frank had joined them. She calmly walked to the table and set the jar of jam onto it, taking her spot beside Kenneth and across the table from Frank. She smiled tentatively, before bowing her head for Daniel's prayer. When she'd been pretending to be a perfect young lady, it had been easy to know what to say to Frank, but now that she was determined to be herself, albeit her new self, it was hard to come up with a topic of conversation. Thankfully, Maggie broke the silence by talking about how much Alison was helping her every day. "For some reason, this pregnancy has left me with no energy at all. I honestly don't know what I'd do if Alison hadn't come to live here." Alison shrugged, blushing. "You'd have gotten by. I'm sure Daniel's mother would have been here every day helping you out." Maggie shook her head. "No, because I would never have let on how tired I was. It was God's perfect timing that brought you here to help me." Alison couldn't meet Frank's eyes after the praise. She couldn't believe how embarrassed she was. If she hadn't really been helping and her sister had said the same thing, she'd have been proud as a peacock. After lunch, Alison stood to help clear the table, but Maggie laid a hand on her arm and shook her head. "You go on out with Frank. I'll take care of this." "Are you sure?" "I don't mind helping." A week ago the words would have been a lie, but now she found she didn't mind the work so much. It really did make her feel good to help others. "I'm sure. Go." She pointed toward the door. It was warm enough she didn't even need a shawl. She followed Frank outside and walked beside him toward the barn. "I didn't expect you to come over this afternoon." She looked up at him, wondering why he had. "Daniel invited me. He told me how hard you've been working this week and said you deserved another chance." He took her hand in his as he walked with her. "It wasn't hard to convince me. I wanted to see you." She blushed. "I'm glad you came. I'm not sure I deserve another chance, but I'm really glad you came." They walked around the house as they talked. She never tried to stray too far from the house, because she knew how important it was to both him and Daniel that they stay within sight at all times. "Have you heard from your parents? Do you know how your father is doing?" She shook her head, feeling tears spring to her eyes. "I miss them. I'd miss my parents if I were that far away as well. I wish." She caught herself before she said what she'd been thinking. She wasn't sure if he would still be interested in a relationship with her if she were to tell him the truth about what had happened to bring her here. "You wish what?" She shook her head, biting her lip. He frowned, wondering what she was hiding from him. "Tell me what you're thinking." She sighed. "Do you know why my parents sent me out here to live with Maggie?" It was time he knew all the truth. Maybe it would change his mind about courting her, but he had the right to know the type of person he was dealing with. "Your father had a heart attack, so they sent you to stay here while he got better." "That's part of it." She stopped next to the barn and leaned against it so she could talk to him. "In February, my best friend, Ruth, and a young man in our church started courting. I was hoping he'd ask my father if he could court me, so I was upset." He nodded. "I can understand that. I pretended I didn't care, but all I could think about was finding a way to make him fall in love with me and forget about her." She looked down at her hands, wringing them together. "I kept sneaking around town jumping out at him. Once I grabbed him and kissed him." She took a deep breath, determined to get it all out. "At their engagement party, I finally had enough. I told her in front of everyone he'd kissed me. When she refused to believe me, I slapped her." Tears rolled down her face. "Right there in front of everyone. Why did you do all that?" He was honestly perplexed. Why would any woman go to so much trouble? Did she love the man that much? "I honestly don't know. I never loved him. I just didn't want her to marry him, I think. Once she was married, she wouldn't be able to do everything I told her to do any longer." She looked into his eyes, hoping he'd understand how sorry she was for what she'd done. "Papa had a heart attack that night. He and Mama dragged me out of the party after I'd slapped Ruth, and they were talking to me. I'd never seen Papa lose his temper before, but he did that night." She could still see how ashen Papa's face had become. "Do you know, I honestly didn't realize the heart attack was my fault until after I was here?" He stood staring at her, wondering just what kind of woman would do all those things, and then admit it so freely. Did she have no remorse? "Maggie and Daniel have helped me to see how self-centered I was. I wrote a letter to Ruth this week, apologizing for my behavior. I'm sure she'll burn it." "She should burn it." She looked over his shoulders at the trees lining the edge of Daniel's property. "Now you know. I understand you won't want to court me any longer." She walked around him and back to the house, the tears still streaming freely down her face. She didn't say a word to Daniel or Maggie, but instead went into her bedroom, shutting the door quietly behind her. She'd made a mess of her life, and she knew it. Frank didn't deserve to be tied to a woman as selfish as she was. Frank stood in the farmyard for a long time after she'd left, wondering what had just happened. He had a lot to think about. A woman who had been so selfish in the past certainly couldn't change that much in the space of a week. Could she? He went into the barn and saddled his horse to leave. Daniel came out of the house and stopped him. What happened? Did you two fight again? Frank shook his head. She told me why she was sent to live out here. Did she admit the heart attack was her fault? Yeah. She admitted to a lot of things. She's definitely not the person I thought she was. He held the reins of his horse in one hand as he faced his brother over the horse's back. I don't know what to think. Honestly? I don't either. I'll tell you one thing, though. She's made some startling changes this week. I've never seen anyone do such an abrupt about-face. She's been spending a lot of time in prayer and studying the Word. I wouldn't have invited you out here today if I hadn't seen some changes in her. His brown eyes met his brother's green. Give her some time. I certainly wouldn't rush into marriage with someone like her, but if you take it slow, and she continues to seem sincere, she might just be the right woman for you. Frank nodded slowly. He simply wasn't sure he was willing to take on a woman who needed to make the kind of changes Alison needed to make before she would be a good wife. He got onto his horse and turned away from his brother and toward home. He was halfway to his farm when he made a sharp turn and instead headed to his parents' house. He needed to talk to his mama and see what she had to say. He breathed a sigh of relief when he rode up to the house and saw no extra horses or wagons. The family went to Millie's one Sunday per month for a family meal, and this wasn't the Sunday, but it was rare for George and Millie to be home alone on a Sunday any time of the month. He tied his horse to the fence and ran to the front door. He rapped once and walked in, knowing his parents wouldn't mind. Millie was sitting with an unfinished quilt on her lap, making tiny stitches, while George sat in his rocking chair beside her, reading aloud from the local paper. They both looked up as he came in. Millie took one look at his face, and asked, "Would you like some coffee while we talk?" Frank shook his head, and pulled a chair from the table so he was facing both of his parents. "I'm glad to catch you two alone. That doesn't happen often anymore." Millie smiled, turning her attention back to her sewing. She could tell her youngest had something on his mind, and he always poured out his heart easier when she seemed to be focused on something else. "Did you have lunch over at Daniel's?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Alison told me the real reason she had to come here. I'm not sure what to think now." Millie raised her eyes to his. "What's the real reason?" "Her father had a heart attack, right?" "Yes, but that's not the whole story." George set the paper down. "That's the only part of the story we know, son. What else is there?" Frank let out his breath in a gush. "Alison told me in confidence, and I know you two don't run around gabbing, but I need you to not mention this to anyone else." "Of course, we won't." Millie kept rocking, her needle moving quickly through the fabric. She was making a quilt for her new grandbaby. Yes, it wouldn't be here for another 6 months, but there was no point in waiting until the last minute. He relayed the whole story to them, leaving out no details. "I just can't reconcile what she told me with what I've seen of her. Sure, she acted like a real brat last Sunday, but she apologized sweetly for it, and Daniel said she's been a lot better since." He sighed, watching his mama's fingers fly over the quilt. "I don't know if I should give up on her, or wait until she works through it all like Daniel said." Millie poked the needle through the quilt to keep it in place. "Daniel and Maggie knew the whole story before she came out here. I could tell something wasn't quite right by the way they acted as they left for the train station." "Did you ask Daniel if you could court Alison?" Frank hung his head. "I did, and he told me she wasn't ready to be courted by anyone." George smiled. "And you decided your big brother didn't know anything about the situation, huh?" "Well, he does have a tendency to still think of me as running around getting in trouble with Charlie when I'm supposed to be doing chores." George laughed at the memories that stirred up. "He does at that." His face grew serious as he saw the anguish on Frank's face. "Daniel was obviously looking out for you, son. He's not going to steer you wrong. If he thinks Alison is really changing, then maybe she is." "Don't jump into anything too fast," Millie cautioned. "You need to keep your head on your shoulders." She's a pretty girl, but she's obviously not strong in the faith. It sounds like she's headed in the right direction, but you can't expect her to just become a good wife overnight. Give it time, son. That's all I can say. Keep courting her. Make sure you stay in public, take her for some long rides. You have plenty of nieces who would love to go for some buggy rides as chaperones. Pick one and go. Always be respectful. I think with Alison, the most important thing is to take it real slow. If she's going to revert to her selfish ways, you need to know before you're married to her. Marriage is forever. Frank nodded slowly. I'll think on everything you said. He looked toward the kitchen, wondering if he could finagle a dinner invitation. What are you cooking tonight, Mama? Millie smiled, knowing if Frank could think of food, he was back to normal. She stood and walked to the kitchen to start dinner for her hungry men. Chapter 7. Alison was a bundle of nerves all through the long week. Twice she lost her temper and yelled at Maggie for simple things. She always apologized and begged Maggie's forgiveness, but it left her feeling terrible about herself. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, she felt like she was a miserable failure and might as well go back to the way she'd been before. She slipped out of bed earlier than usual on Sunday morning, hoping to have breakfast made before Maggie got out of bed. Maggie was having a hard time cooking in the mornings, because her morning sickness was so bad. By the time Daniel and Maggie emerged from their bedroom, Daniel to milk the cows and Maggie to fix breakfast, Alison had 2 pieces of dry toast and some weak tea ready for her sister. She led Maggie to her rocker and said, "I'm almost done with breakfast. Eat this and drink your tea." She'd overheard Millie suggest the dry toast and weak tea to Maggie for her morning sickness. Maggie kept saying this pregnancy was so different from her others. She'd had morning sickness with her older 2, but not nearly as persistent as this was. "Thank you. I'm so glad you're here to help out. I don't know what I'd do without you." Alison felt tears prick her eyes. "But I yelled at you twice this week." Maggie smiled and grabbed Alison's hand before she turned away. "Do you realize that you yelled at me twice in the first hour you were here, and this week you only yelled at me twice? You're doing so much better than you were." Alison thought about Maggie's words as she returned to her breakfast preparations. Maggie was right. She was improving more than she'd realized. Maggie was still sitting in her rocker when Daniel arrived back inside from milking the cows. Alison had breakfast on the table and both children were patiently waiting for him. It was a simple breakfast of eggs and toast, but it was filling and perfect for before church on Sunday. For a woman who had cooked her first foods a little over a week ago, Alison was doing amazingly well. He quickly washed his hands and took his seat. Glancing over at Maggie, he asked, "Are you well enough to join us?" Maggie shook her head. "Just the smell of the food from that close is going to make me sick." "Okay." He bowed his head and said a prayer of thanks for the food. When he added a thanks for bringing Alison to them at a time when she was so badly needed by their family, Alison felt the tears flowing down her face. After the prayer, she met Daniel's eyes. "Thank you. Your words meant a lot to me. You've made a big difference to our family with your hard work and selflessness. I don't know how we'd make it through all this without you." Alison smiled at his praise and quietly ate her breakfast. After breakfast dishes were done, she asked, "Do you want me to start something for lunch?" Maggie thought about it for a moment. "Why don't we do a picnic down by the lake for lunch? You could make some sandwiches, and we have some potato salad left from dinner last night. Would you mind?" Alison hurried to do as her sister asked, carefully wrapping each sandwich in paper to keep it from drying out. Once she was ready for church, she dressed Helen in her Sunday dress and met the rest of the family in the main room. Alison was surprised to see Frank waiting outside the church when they arrived. He helped Alison down and walked into the church with her as if nothing had happened. "Does this mean you don't care about what I told you last Sunday?" she asked tentatively. Frank looked down at her and sighed. "I care. I just think you deserve another chance. What you did is in your past, and you've made strides toward bringing your life in line with Christ. I'm going to be cautious, and I want us to take it slowly, but I'm not ready to give up on a possible relationship between us. Alison's face lit up as she smiled at him. Thank you for giving me a chance. I haven't been perfect, and I never will be, but I'm doing my best. Frank squeezed the hand that rested on his arm. I'll help you in any way I can. After church, Alison once again saw Daniel talking with Frank. Frank glanced over at her and she blushed. She leaned over and whispered in Maggie's ear, "Am I paranoid or are Daniel and Frank talking about me?" Maggie let out a soft laugh. "Oh, they're definitely talking about you." Alison sighed and plopped down onto the pew beside Maggie. That's what I was afraid of. She nudged Maggie with her elbow. Do they seem to be saying good things about me? Maggie giggled. She'd never had the opportunity to just be a sister to Alison, being so much older and always held out as an example. It had never occurred to her that doing simple sister things with Alison could be so much fun. She sneaked a look at the two brothers. Well, they're both smiling. Daniel seems to be doing most of the talking and Frank is nodding and listening. She looked at Alison, who seemed to be trying to sink into the pew of the church. If Daniel's talking about you, he's saying good things. He keeps telling me how amazed he is at how much you've changed in the past couple of weeks. Alison stared down at her feet, her mind off the two brothers. I haven't changed that much. Inside, I still want to yell and scream things aren't fair. Don't get me wrong, I like helping you, but I still get mad about the smallest things. Alison worried night and day she'd never be able to truly change. She'd been selfish for so long, was it really possible? Maggie squeezed Alison's hand. I feel like screaming sometimes too. Remember when Helen got hold of the eggs yesterday and she threw 4 of them on the floor before we stopped her? It was all I could do not to start screaming at my baby. I cleaned it up, but remember I asked you to clean Helen? That was why. I was so frustrated with the mess. Alison's eyes widened in surprise. To her, Maggie had always been the perfect Christian. Her voice was always soft and sweet. She never stomped or yelled or threw things. She'd always felt inferior to Maggie. Really? You were angry? I couldn't even tell. Maggie smiled, hugging a sleeping Helen to her. Of course, I was mad. They were the eggs we were planning on making a cake with. She made a big mess, and just seeing the slimy eggs on my floor added to my nausea. She shrugged. I think that being angry for a moment is one thing. It's another to act on your anger. Don't let your anger consume you. Alison thought about her sister's words as Frank came over to chat. Daniel invited me to go on a picnic with all of you if you packed enough lunch. His eyes met Alison's. Did you? She smiled shyly. Of course, I did. I was hoping you'd join us. I'd like to. Kenneth came barreling across the church and buried his face in Alison's lap, his little shoulder shaking with tears. She scooped him up into her arms. What is it? Why are you crying? He clung to her neck so she kissed his head, hugging him close, knowing instinctively that's what the little boy needed. Her eyes met Frank's over his head. She mouthed the word, sorry. Frank shook his head and waited for Kenneth to calm down. Finally, he pulled away. Bart called me a baby. Bart was Michael, Frank's oldest brother, and his wife Elizabeth's youngest son. He was 4 and considered himself superior to Kenneth in every way. Well, that's terrible. Do you want me to go kick him for you? Kenneth's eyes grew wide as he shook his head. Well, do you want me to go and push him down? Kenneth shook his head again, his eyes starting to twinkle. How about I go tell his mama that he's rude and doesn't deserve to ever eat dessert again? Kenneth giggled. No, just let me down so I can go play with him. Kenneth followed Bart around everywhere at church and every family gathering. He looked up to Bart as an older cousin and friend. Alison pressed a kiss to his cheek before setting him on the floor and watching him race off to play with his cousins. She turned her attention back to Frank. Sorry about that. Being called a baby really upsets him. Frank grinned. He'd enjoyed the exchange between his young nephew and Alison. I was the same way. It's hard being the youngest of 8. Alison nodded emphatically. It was hard being the youngest of 2 with a perfect sister ahead of me. I am not, and never was, perfect. Maggie sputtered. Alison shrugged and leaned close to Frank to whisper, perfect. Always perfect. She even had the perfect response to me saying she was perfect. Frank threw his head back and laughed. He'd always thought Maggie was a little too good to be true, but he'd never lived with her. He could list the imperfections in all his siblings with ease. She's always seemed that way to me, too. Maggie got to her feet, still clutching Helen. I'm not going to sit here and listen to this. I'm anything but perfect. Maggie walked off to join the group of women Millie and Faith were part of. Alison looked at Frank with a twinkle in her eye. I finally know how to get rid of her when I want to. I wonder if that would work with Daniel. Alison giggled. I'll have to try it and see. Faith, Daniel's twin, made her way over to them. What are you two plotting? Frank and Alison dissolved into laughter. Nothing, Frank denied quickly. Faith shook her head. We're all going on a picnic down by the lake this afternoon. I'm going to ride over with you two to chaperone. Alison smiled at Faith. Thank you. Faith shrugged. Thank Maggie. It was her idea. Alison looked back at Frank and mouthed the word, perfect. Frank bit his lip to keep from laughing. I think I'll go back and talk to Mama and the other ladies, though. You two are acting strangely. She walked back to the group of women she'd been with. Alison's eyes met Frank's. Were we rude to her? Frank shook his head. Nah. You're supposed to treat your siblings like that. It keeps them guessing. The ride to the lake for the picnic took almost an hour, and Alison was thrilled to get to sit between Frank and Faith as they drove. Alison and Frank sat together on a blanket while everyone else scattered around. After they'd finished eating, Millie walked over to Alison and handed her 2 letters. Alison's heart beat faster as she saw Ruth's name and return address on one and her parents on the other. She thanked Millie and set the letters aside to read later when she was alone. Frank raised an eyebrow in question and she shook her head. Letters from home. I'm not sure what they're going to say, so I'll wait to read them alone. I can leave you alone to read them now. No, I'll wait. I have a feeling I have a lot of crying to do when I read them. She was half afraid to open them both. What if no one was willing to forgive her? And why should they? Right now, she couldn't even forgive herself. Frank looked at the letters for a moment, and finally asked the question burning in his mind. Who are they from? She looked down. My parents and my friend, Ruth. I wrote them asking forgiveness for the things I've done. He nodded, watching her face. Are you worried they won't forgive you? Her eyes were shining with tears as they met his. I can't even forgive myself. How could they forgive me? He took her hand in his, squeezing it tightly. Have you asked God for forgiveness? She shook her head. I guess that's the first step, but I feel like what I've done is so terrible I don't want God to know about it, even though I know He already does. She laughed at herself. I know that sounds stupid, but it's how I feel. The first step to forgiving yourself is to ask God for His forgiveness. Yes, He knows what you did, but you need to tell Him as well, and ask for forgiveness from Him and ask that He help you forgive yourself. You won't feel better until you've done that. She sighed, looked down at her hands. I know. I've been praying more than ever before, and studying the Word, so I can build a better relationship with Him, but I feel like I've been hiding my past. I need to pray for forgiveness and for courage to open those letters. Would you mind if I came by tomorrow evening to see what happened with the letters? That would be nice. Plan on coming for dinner. I'll fix something simple, because I have no clue how to fix something special. He laughed. Simple is better than my own cooking. Anything is better than my own cooking. She grinned. 3 weeks ago, I'd have said the same thing. I find I really am enjoying cooking, though. I'd definitely surprised myself. The cries of Uncle Frank interrupted then. The children were putting together a baseball game. We need you to pitch, Uncle Frank. Charlie's pitching for the other team. We can't beat them without you. What about Eddie? Jacob, Patience's second son, who was 17, made a face. Uncle Eddie's good at catching, but he can't pitch. Please, Uncle Frank? Frank looked at Alison. Do you mind? Not if I get to play, too. You play baseball? He'd never known a woman to play baseball other than Faith, and she'd stopped since she became a mother. She shrugged. I never have, but I'd love to try. He stood and reached down his hand to help her to her feet. Faith used to play. Maybe I can talk her into jumping in as well. Jacob looked surprised. I remember that. I'll go get her. He ran off toward the others, stopping in front of Faith. With all the children who were old enough to play and the men and Faith and Alison, they had more than enough people to form two teams. Alison wished she'd worn one of her everyday dresses instead of her church dress. She laughed and cheered with the others, and found she had a lot of fun. At her third at-bat, Kenneth ran over. I want to play Aunt Allie. Alison looked down at him. Her team was down 1 run. She looked at Frank, who had just run to third, for help. Frank shrugged with a big grin. She took the bat and helped the little boy hold it. Okay, Kenny, here's how we'll do it. We'll hit the ball, and then we need to run really fast. See Aunt Faith over there? She pointed in the direction of first base. We have to run just as fast as we can to Aunt Faith. Kenneth nodded, his grin wider than she'd ever seen it. She knew she wasn't at her best with her bottom stuck up in the air as she bent over to help the little boy hold the bat, but she didn't care. Charlie, Patience's oldest son, who was the same age as Frank, pitched it low right over the plate. Alison and Kenneth swung and hit it. Alison dropped the bat and grabbed Kenneth's hand, running with him to first base. She saw Charlie deliberately drop the ball twice as they ran. When they made it to first base, she hugged Kenneth. We did it. We made it to first base. Frank had rounded the bases while they ran, taking advantage of everyone watching the little boy to even up the score. Kenneth giggled and bounced up and down, happy to be playing with the big kids for a change. The next batter, Michael, struck out and the inning was over. Kenneth went to the outfield to try to catch the balls flying out with Alison. Alison had never had as much fun in her life as she did playing baseball with the Stevens family. Once it was over, she wasn't sure who'd won, and really didn't care. On the ride home, Kenneth sat in her lap, talking about hitting the ball. She couldn't believe what a good feeling it gave her to make him happy. When they arrived home, she turned to Maggie. I'm going to go in my room and read the letters I got today. I'll come out and help with dinner as soon as I'm done, if that's okay. Maggie nodded. She was tired from being outside all day, and was thankful she had Alison there to help her. Alison slipped into her room and instead of opening the letters immediately, dropped to her knees and prayed. She confessed all of her wrongdoing to God, and asked His forgiveness. She was surprised by how much better she felt as she sat on the bed and opened the first letter. Dear Alison, of course I forgive you. I hope you're having a good time with Maggie and her family. Your father is doing much better. He should be able to go back to work next week. He sends his love. Maggie wrote me and told me that you've changed a great deal. She said you're cooking and cleaning and even helping with the laundry. I'm very proud of you. I know it's hard to make big changes in your life, and it sounds like you're doing it. Good for you. We'll be ready for you to come home by the end of the summer. Your father should be healthy enough by then. We miss you. Love, Mama. Alison swiped at the tear under her eye. This letter was much as she hoped it would be, with the exception of the idea of going home at the end of the summer. She didn't know if she ever wanted to go home. People there expected her to act like a spoiled brat, and it was easy to do as they expected. Here, she was expected to act as a good Christian woman, so it was easy to do as was expected. It was amazing how different expectations made it easy for her to act differently. She held the letter from Ruth in her hand for a moment, wondering if she should wait until later to read it. She was unsure as to what it would say, but she hoped for the best. Dear Alison, I'm hurt by all that has happened between us, but more than that, I miss you. You're the best friend I've ever had. I think it's good that you're away for a while, but I look forward to the day when you return. Of course, I forgive you. We all sin every day, and God forgives us, so how could I not forgive you? I wish you hadn't had to miss my wedding. It wasn't the same without you standing beside me. I love being married to Walter. He's everything I dreamed a husband would be. Hurry home so I can show you the photograph of me in my wedding dress. With love, Ruth. Alison set the letter down on her bed and sobbed. How could Ruth so easily forgive the things she'd said and done? She'd humiliated Ruth in front of her family and friends, and still Ruth told her she was her closest friend. After a minute, she sat up and brushed her tears aside. She couldn't lie on the bed feeling sorry for herself when her sister needed her. She slipped out of the room and went out to see what Maggie wanted her to make for dinner. Chapter 8. Alison showed Frank both of the letters the following evening. He read the one from her parents first, a frown on his face. After reading the one from Ruth, he smiled. So did you cry? Alison nodded. I did. I couldn't stop. I cried the whole time I was cooking dinner too. But you cooked anyway, didn't you? I did. Maggie napped while I cooked. That's getting to be a way of life for us around here. So, are you planning on going home at the end of the summer? He watched her carefully for her reaction to the question. He didn't want her to leave that quickly. She sighed. I don't want to. The people there expect me to be one way and one way only. I think if I go back, I'll slip into my old selfish ways, and I don't want that at all. She leaned against the fence as she spoke. I don't want to go back to being bad, Alison. I like helping others and doing things for people. If I tried that back home, people would ask what I wanted. He took her hand in his. I don't want you to go. She smiled. I'm sure I'll stay at least until Maggie's baby is born. I can use the excuse that Maggie needs me. After that, I may not have a choice. I can't ask Daniel and Maggie to let me stay here forever. She wished she could, though. She couldn't believe how much happier she was now that she wasn't just taking from others. Hopefully by then, you'll have another reason to stay. She smiled up at him, love in her eyes. You know, I hope so, too. I really care about you. More than Walter? She laughed. I only liked Walter because he had a motor car. I was determined to go for a ride in it. I didn't actually want to marry the man. Frank grinned. Are you saying you like me for me, not for my possessions? Of course, I do. I don't know what you have other than a horse and a wagon. I rode in your wagon yesterday. I'm glad. They walked across the yard and sat on the bench in front of the house. Supper was good tonight. Did you make it? Maggie told me what to do, but I made it while she napped. I'm getting kind of worried about her. She said none of her other pregnancies were this hard on her. Frank frowned. Mama always says her only tough pregnancy was when she carried Daniel and Faith. Maggie would definitely have her hands full if she had twins. Can you imagine? For under the age of 5? Well, you'd have to stay for sure then, wouldn't you? I would. She rubbed the back of her neck. Mama was a twin. You never know. She hid a yawn behind her hand. She'd thought going to bed at 8 in the evening was crazy, but she'd begun to think of it as a necessity with as full as her days were here. He stood. I'm sorry to keep you up. He squeezed her hand as she stood beside him. I'll see you on Sunday. She smiled brightly. I can't wait. She sat down at the table as soon as she was inside and responded to the letter from her mama. If Frank didn't want her to go either, then she'd just say Maggie needed the help. It wasn't a lie at all. The longer Alison stayed in Minnesota, the more she loved it. She loved living in the country. She enjoyed the cooler summer days. She even got to the point where she didn't hate the smell of manure. She still got angry more than she thought she should, but she'd learned to bite her tongue and not yell at the people around her. She felt like she had a true relationship with God, and was thankful for it every day. By the time September rolled around, she never wanted to leave. Maggie had gotten more and more tired as her pregnancy progressed. Alison had never spent any real time around a pregnant woman, and was surprised to hear her sister get short with the children at times. Daniel told her it was just how women got when they were pregnant, which made her feel bad for her sister. One afternoon in mid-September, Alison wasn't paying attention and she burned a pan of cookies she was making for a church bake sale that Sunday. She threw the burnt cookies into the slop pail to be taken out to the pigs in the evening and promptly put in another batch. Maggie came out of her bedroom, with one hand pressed to her low back. "What do I smell burning?" Alison shrugged. "I was working on finishing up the shawl I was knitting, and I lost track of the time." "I'm sorry. Why can't you just pay attention and do things right? What is your problem?" Alison stared at her sister in shock. She'd never yelled at her before. "Are you feeling okay, Maggie? Why does everyone keep asking me that?" "Of course, I'm not feeling okay. I feel like I'm a pumpkin. My back hurts and my feet hurt, and I'm just sick of everything. Would you like me to make you some tea? And I have some cookies here. Not the burnt ones," she hastened to add. "Some that turned out well. Do you want some?" Maggie burst into tears. "Why are you being nice to me when I'm being so mean? When did you become the nice sister?" Alison felt like laughing, but didn't. She knew her sister was feeling poorly, and that was the reason for her bad behavior. She was surprised when Maggie called her the nice sister. It felt good to be the nice one for a change. "Sit down in your chair. I'll bring you something." She quickly fixed Maggie a pot of tea and took her a mug with some cookies. She glanced up at the door to see Frank standing there with a grin on his face. "How long have you been there?" Frank smiled. "Long enough. Can you come outside with me for a minute?" Alison turned to Maggie. Both children were sleeping and she just took the last pan of cookies out of the oven. "I'll be right outside if the children wake up, okay?" Maggie waved her away, not saying a word. Alison followed Frank outside. "I was just about to knock on the door when I heard Maggie yelling. At first I thought it was you, but after a minute, I realized you were the one being yelled at." Alison shrugged. "I don't think Maggie has ever yelled at me before. She's almost to her due date. I think we'll all be thrilled when that baby gets here. I'm really impressed with how calmly you took the whole thing. The old Alison would have started yelling back, but you just offered to do something to help her feel better. You've really changed." Alison blushed. "I've done my best." She looked at him. "It's the middle of harvest. Why are you here?" Daniel was worried about Maggie. He said he just felt like something was wrong, so I thought I'd come and check on her really quick. "I'm glad I did. You'd better get back then." "She's okay. Just tired." She started to go back inside. "Do you want to take some cookies with you? I can bake more for the sale tomorrow. It won't hurt a thing." Frank smiled. "I think we could all use a cookie break right about now." She hurried into the house and came out with a basket filled with cookies. "I'll see you on Sunday." "Thank you." Alison watched him go and went back inside to check on Maggie. As soon as Alison opened the door, Maggie let out a huge breath of air. "You need to go get Millie." "I'm in labor." Alison's eyes widened. "Frank was just here to check on you. See if you can catch him." Maggie sat at the edge of her chair taking deep breaths. "I'm on my way." Alison ran outside and yelled Frank's name at the top of her lungs. She didn't see him, but that didn't mean anything with the barn being in the way. Within moments he rode back around the barn. "What's wrong?" She ran to him. "Maggie's in labor. We need your mother and Daniel." He handed the cookies back to her. "I only heard you because I was riding slower because of the cookies. I'll get them here as quick as I can." He turned his horse and raced off in the direction of his parents' farm. Alison hurried back inside. "What can I do?" Maggie gave her quick instructions on how to prepare her room for the birth. Alison followed her instructions exactly. She wasn't sure what she'd do if the baby started to come before Millie arrived. Kenneth woke up and Alison set him at the table eating milk and cookies. She needed to get both children out of the house, but wasn't sure where to take them. Millie hurried into the house a few minutes later. "How's she doing?" Alison shrugged. "I don't know. I have no idea what to do or how to help. I'm trying to do what she tells me." Millie patted Alison's back and rushed to her daughter-in-law. Alison went back to concentrating on Kenneth and listening for Helen to wake up. Daniel rushed in a moment later. "How is she, Mama?" Millie turned to her son. "She's fine, but we need to send the children to Faith." "Alison? Can you take them?" Alison nodded. "I think so. I've never driven a wagon, but I'll try." She went into her room to wake Helen from her nap and quickly changed her diaper. When she got back into the main room, Frank was standing holding Kenneth's hand. "There's Aunt Ally." He looked at Alison. "I'm going to drive you three to Faith in Daniel's wagon. After he left the field, I thought I might be needed." She hurried outside, carrying Helen, and watched while Frank hitched up the wagon. "I don't want the children to hear her." Frank nodded. "It's best this way. You three can spend a night with Faith and come back tomorrow. I didn't bring any diapers for Helen." "I'll run back in." Daniel came out then with a small canvas bag. "Mama said to give you this. Diapers and clothes for the children." He quickly hugged Alison. "Thank you for taking care of my babies. There's no one I'd trust them with more." He didn't wait for her to respond but went back into the house. Alison put Helen on the wagon seat and climbed up after Frank offered her his hand. She took Kenneth when Frank handed him up. She put Kenneth on the seat next to her and picked Helen up to hold her for the ride. She looked down at Kenneth. "I hope you know how to be a good chaperone, Kenny." "I'll try," he said in his most grown-up voice. She laughed as Frank got onto the wagon seat and started driving them toward town. "Thanks for driving us to Faith's house." "No problem. That's my nephew or niece too, you know." "That's true. I hope it's a girl." Frank shrugged. "I have so many nephews and nieces I barely notice which ones are born anymore." "You're terrible. My oldest nephew is my age, and Patience started having babies when I was 9. I really don't even know how many I have at this point." He paused for a second as he watched the road. "You know what I would notice, though?" She shook her head. "I have no idea. I'd notice whether my kids were boys or girls." "How about it?" "How about what?" What was he talking about? "How about marrying me so we can have kids and I can remember which are boys and which are girls?" She blinked at him a few times. "Was that a proposal?" "Yup. It's certainly not the proposal I dreamed of." She hugged Helen to her, trying to hide her excitement. "I guess it'll work, though. Yeah, I'll marry you." She'd known months before that she loved him and would marry him if he asked. "How do you feel about October weddings?" She looked at him. "You want to wait a year?" "I was thinking maybe spring." He shook his head. "Not next year. Next month. I can't plan a wedding that fast. Not with Maggie having a new baby. I'll have to make a dress and plan a wedding supper." "How do you think I can do that in a month?" He shrugged. "Wear Maggie's dress. It was pretty. Mama will help plan the wedding." "You can't be serious." "Sure I am. We've been courting for 5 months already. My brother and your sister got married the day after they met. Mama met Papa at the front of the church when she was saying I do." "But..." Alison couldn't think of a single reason she couldn't marry him in a month except it was fast to plan a wedding, but he was right. His mama would help. She was the same size Maggie had been before she'd started having babies. She could wear her dress without a problem. It was feasible. "I'll have to see if my parents can make it out for the wedding. They can stay with Mama and Papa." They have plenty of room now that all the kids are gone. I want to invite Ruth and Walter, too. He shrugged. As long as Walter doesn't bring his motor car. She smiled. Okay, October. How about the last week in October? That would give her 6 weeks to plan the wedding. She could do that with Millie's help. How about the first day of October? Mid-October? He sighed. I guess that'll work. 1 month and not a day longer. He reached over Kenneth and took her hand. I can't wait until you're my wife. Kenneth took their hands and separated them. No touching, I'm the chaperone. Alison looked down at Kenneth. Did your daddy teach you to say that? Kenneth nodded. Uh-huh. He said if I ever have to be a chaperone, no touching. Frank groaned. Thwarted by my big brother, and he's not even here. Epilogue. Alison looked around Faith's house frantically. Maggie had said Ruth was there, but she hadn't had a chance to talk to her yet. Finally, Alison spotted her sitting with Walter at one of the tables set up for the wedding supper. She squeezed Frank's arm and whispered, I need to talk to Ruth. Frank nodded and watched her go. Maggie's dress fit Alison beautifully. He couldn't believe he'd married such a beautiful woman. Alison had turned into someone he could truly be proud to introduce as his wife. He watched her hug a short mousy woman with brown hair and eyes. Both of them were crying. A tall blonde man stood watching the two warily. He wandered over to make sure everything was okay. Alison saw him and smiled, taking his hand in hers. Ruth, this is my husband, Frank. Frank, this is my dearest friend, Ruth, and her husband, Walter. Frank shook hands with Ruth and then Walter. It's nice meeting you both. Walter still watched Alison carefully. We almost didn't come, but Ruth and Alison's mother wore me down and convinced me that Alison had changed. His eyes met Frank's. For your sake, I hope they're right. Frank smiled. I know all about what she did, and I assure you, she's different now. Alison nodded. I really am, Walter. I'm very sorry for everything I did back home to try to split you and Ruth up. Walter watched her face, seeming to finally believe her. Okay. He looked at his wife with eyes full of love. Did you tell Alison our good news? Alison turned to Ruth. Not yet, tell me. Ruth blushed and touched her stomach. We're expecting. Alison squealed and hugged Ruth again. I'm so happy for you. I've been helping with my brand new nieces. I hope you don't end up with twins. Maggie's are a handful. Ruth smiled. I'd be thrilled with 1 or 2 as long as they're healthy. When are you due? In May. My mother is already sewing for him. I can't wait to hold him in my arms. Or her. Belinda Baines came over then, holding one of her new granddaughters in each arm. Alison, Maggie's still having trouble telling the babies apart. She said you dressed them and you'd know which was which. Alison grinned and pointed at the baby cradled in her mother's left arm. That one's Esther, Mama. Belinda let out a sigh of relief. Oh, good. I was afraid we'd lost track of who was whom. Alison laughed. Well, they are identical, Mama. Belinda held up the other baby. That means this one is Ruby. She turned away, calling back over her shoulder, Thanks, Alison. I'll run and tell Maggie. Ruth laughed. Your mother is really taking to being a grandmother. Alison nodded. I know. I think she's trying to talk Papa into moving out here. After a week with her 4 grandchildren, it's going to be all he can do to make her go home. I'm sure there'll be lots more to come, Frank said with a smile, slipping his arm around Alison's waist. I sure hope so. Alison told him. Ruth looked surprised. You always said you didn't want children. Frank shook his head. Take everything you know about evil Alison and wipe it from your mind. She's a totally different person. She's great with kids. Ruth eyed Alison skeptically. Is he serious? Just then, Kenneth ran over and tugged on Alison's dress, his hands covered with chocolate icing from the piece of wedding cake he'd just finished eating. Aunt Alison. Alison ignored the huge spot on her dress. Yes, Kenny? I just want to tell you I love you, and I'm sad you're moving in with Uncle Frank. I'll come over any time you want, so you won't get lonely while he's working. Alison squatted on the floor beside him, hugging him tightly. I'm so glad you're willing to do that for me. I'm sure I'm going to get lonely a lot. Do you think Helen and Esther and Ruby and your mama will all come too? Kenneth nodded. I'm sure they'd love to. He saw his cousins playing over her shoulder. I gotta go. We're gonna play hide and seek. Aunt Faith has the best house for hide and seek in the whole wide world. Okay, you have fun. Alison grinned as he ran off to play. She stood up and looked down at the chocolate all over her dress, laughing softly. What a mess. Oh well, a hug is better than a clean dress any day. Ruth shook her head. You really have changed. You're not a brat anymore. You thought I was a brat? Walter nodded emphatically. I'd never met anyone who fit the definition of brat as well as you did. You're welcome to visit us anytime, Alison. It's nice to see how much you've changed. Alison smiled. With God, anything is possible.